Nosgoth AS A World, opening segment. Before we speak of vampires and their wars, before we trace the bloodlines of Kain or follow Raziel through his damnation and resurrection, we must first understand Nosgoth itself. Not as a backdrop, not as a stage upon which these tragedies unfold, but as a participant, a victim, a world that bleeds. Because Nosgoth is dying. It has been dying for a very long time. And to understand why requires us to look at the very foundation upon which this world was built, and the moment that foundation cracked. The pillars, the world's skeleton. At the heart of Nosgoth stand 9 pillars. Not monuments, not architecture in any conventional sense. They are older than human civilization, older than recorded history. They are the pillars of Nosgoth, and they are the literal pillars holding this world together. The health of Nosgoth is tied to the pillars. Not metaphorically, not spiritually, literally. When the pillars stand pure and uncorrupted, the land flourishes. The seasons turn as they should. Life flows in its natural rhythms. The world breathes easily. But when the pillars are corrupted, that corruption bleeds into the world itself. The land grows sick. The water turns foul. The very air becomes heavy with wrongness. It's not that the pillars represent the world's health. They are the world's health, made manifest in stone and light. Each pillar embodies a principle: mind, dimension, conflict, nature, energy, time, states, death, and balance, which sits above them all, the keystone that holds the others in harmony. Together, these 9 pillars don't just support Nosgoth. They are Nosgoth in the most fundamental sense. They are the threads that hold reality together in this place. And they have been poisoned. The circle of 9, guardians and prisoners. The pillars do not maintain themselves. Each one is bound to a guardian, a human born with an intrinsic connection to one of the 9 principles. These guardians form the circle of 9, and their purpose is singular: to serve as living conduits between the pillars and the world, to keep the balance, to ensure that Nosgoth continues to exist. It is not a role they choose. It is a role they are born into. The moment a guardian dies, a new one is born somewhere in Nosgoth, marked from birth with this burden. They will feel the call of their pillar. They will be drawn to it. And eventually, they will take their place in the circle. This is how it has always been. Generation after generation, the circle renews itself. The guardians change, but the pillars endure. But here is what makes the circle so terribly fragile. The guardians are human. They have human hearts, human minds, human capacity for love and hate and madness and corruption. And when a guardian falls into darkness, when their soul becomes twisted, that corruption flows directly into the pillar they serve. And from the pillar, it spreads into the world. It is an elegant system, in theory. 9 humans bearing the weight of an entire world's continued existence. But it is also a system with 9 points of failure. 9 souls that can break. 9 cracks through which the entire world can begin to crumble. And it only takes 1 crack to begin the collapse. Ariel's murder, the first crack. Her name was Ariel, and she was the balance guardian. The 9th guardian. The one who stood at the center of the circle, maintaining harmony between the other 8 principles. If the pillars were the skeleton of the world, balance was the spine. She was murdered. The details of how it happened are perhaps less important than the fact that it happened at all. Someone killed a pillar guardian. And in doing so, they didn't just end a life. They struck at the very foundation of Nosgoth itself. When Ariel died, her pillar immediately began to corrupt. But she did not move on. Her spirit remained, bound to her pillar, trapped between life and death, unable to rest, unable to fulfill her role. A ghost, chained to the very thing she was meant to protect, watching helplessly as it began to decay. And because balance was compromised, the entire circle began to destabilize. The corruption didn't stay contained to one pillar. It began to spread, slowly, inexorably, like poison in water. The other guardians could feel it. The wrongness. The growing sickness in the world they were supposed to maintain. But one guardian felt it more acutely than the others. Nupraptor's madness, corruption cascading. Nupraptor was the guardian of the mind. He was also Ariel's lover. When she was murdered, something inside him broke. The grief was instantaneous, total, and overwhelming. And because Nupraptor was the guardian of the mind, because he was fundamentally connected to that principle, his madness did not remain private. It could not remain contained within his own skull. His anguish poured directly into the pillar of the mind. And from there, it radiated outward. The circle of 9 was bound together, each guardian connected to the others through their shared service to the pillars. And so Nupraptor's madness infected them all. Not all at once. Not obviously. But like a slow-acting poison, it seeped into their minds, twisted their thoughts, darkened their souls. The guardian of conflict became more violent. The guardian of death became more nihilistic. Each guardian's corruption took a different shape, reflecting both Nupraptor's madness and their own individual weaknesses. But the source was the same. One broken heart, one shattered mind, spreading like a plague through the very system meant to hold the world together. This is the terrible irony of the circle. The same connections that allow the guardians to maintain Nosgoth also ensure that when one falls, they all fall. The corruption cascades. It multiplies. And there is no way to stop it, because the system itself is the vector of infection. By the time anyone understood what was happening, it was already too late. The pillars were corrupted. The circle was corrupted. And Nosgoth began its long, slow death. The pillar's true purpose, a prison veiled. But there is another layer to this tragedy. Because the pillars of Nosgoth are not simply supports holding up the world. They are also a prison. Long before Kain, before the vampire purges, before recorded history, there was a war. The ancient vampires fought against another race called the Hyaldan. The details of that war have been lost to time, but its conclusion has not. The ancient vampires won. And they did not simply defeat the Hyaldan. They banished them. The pillars were raised, or perhaps repurposed, to serve as a barrier between dimensions. A lock on a door that could not be opened from the other side. The Hyaldan were cast into the demon realm, and the pillars ensured they could never return. This is what the pillars truly are: a seal, a ward, a prison wall between Nosgoth and the realm where the Hyaldan were exiled. Which means that every time a pillar weakens, every time the corruption spreads a little further, that prison becomes a little less secure. The barrier thins. And on the other side, the Hyaldan wait. They have been waiting for centuries. Waiting for the pillars to fail. Waiting for the door to open. The corruption of the circle, then, is not just a tragedy for Nosgoth. It is an opportunity for the Hyaldan. Every crack in a pillar is a crack in their prison. Every corrupted guardian is one step closer to their freedom. The world supports are failing. And when they fail completely, something else will come through. Fate and history, forces made real. In Nosgoth, history is not a metaphor. Fate is not a philosophical concept. They are real, tangible forces that shape events as surely as gravity shapes the fall of a stone. The pillars themselves are proof of this. They do not simply reflect the world's health. They dictate it. The corruption of a guardian does not symbolize the world's decay. It causes it, directly and measurably. And the timeline of Nosgoth is not a simple linear progression. It is a loop, or perhaps a spiral, where cause and effect twist back on themselves. Events that have not yet happened cast shadows backward through time. Decisions made in the future ripple into the past. Raziel's very existence is a paradox, and yet Nosgoth accommodates that paradox, bends around it, makes space for it within the structure of reality. This is a world where destiny is not an abstract notion. It is a weight you can feel pressing down on your shoulders. Characters speak of fate not as superstition but as observable fact. History abhors a paradox, the elder god will say. And in Nosgoth, this is not poetry. It is physics. The corruption of the pillars, then, was perhaps inevitable. Perhaps Ariel was always going to be murdered. Perhaps Nupraptor was always going to go mad. Perhaps the entire tragic cascade was locked into the timeline from the very beginning, a decay that could not be prevented because it had already happened, was happening, would always happen. Or perhaps not. Perhaps there was a moment when things could have gone differently. Perhaps there still is. But what is certain is this: Nosgoth is a world where the past is not fixed and the future is not open. Where time itself can be wounded. where history can be rewritten, but only at terrible cost, and where the characters are not simply living through events, but struggling against the weight of a destiny that may have already been written. The world itself is wounded. So when we look at Nosgoth, what do we see? We see a world held together by 9 pillars, and all 9 pillars are poisoned. We see a system designed to be eternal, but vulnerable at 9 specific points, and all 9 points have failed. We see a prison that has held for centuries, now cracking, with something ancient and angry waiting on the other side. We see a timeline that twists back on itself, where the past is not safe and the future is not certain. And we see a land that is dying. Not quickly, not mercifully, but slowly, inevitably, bleeding out from a wound that was opened generations ago and has never healed. This is the world into which Kain is born. This is the world Raziel will be resurrected into. This is the stage upon which their tragedy unfolds. But it is not merely a stage. Nosgoth is not background scenery. It is a participant, a victim, a world that has been broken, and that may be beyond repair. And everything that happens, every choice Kain makes, every betrayal, every act of defiance or submission, happens in the shadow of this fundamental truth. The world is wounded, and it is bleeding to death. The only question is whether anyone can stop it, or whether that was ever possible at all. Act 2. Ancients, Hyaldan, and the original sin. But to understand how we arrived at this moment of corruption, we must go back. Further back than Ariel's murder. Further back than the human circle. Back to a time before humans held the pillars at all. Back to when vampires were not monsters. Back to when they were guardians. The ancient vampires, first stewards. There was a time when vampires were Nosgoth's intended caretakers. Not parasites. Not predators lurking in the shadows, feeding on humanity. But stewards, chosen by the pillars themselves to maintain the balance of the world. The ancient vampires were not like the vampires that would come later. They were long-lived, yes. Powerful, yes. But they were also something more. They were fundamentally connected to Nosgoth in a way that went beyond mere habitation. They were woven into the fabric of the world, their existence intertwined with the health of the land itself. They did not see themselves as rulers, though they certainly had power. They saw themselves as servants, custodians of a world that had been entrusted to their care. The pillars were their charge, and they took that charge seriously. For centuries, perhaps millennia, they maintained the balance. The world was whole. The pillars stood uncorrupted, and the ancient vampires watched over it all. This is important to understand. Vampires were not originally abominations. They were not mistakes or curses or diseases. They were meant to be here. They had a purpose, a role that was not just tolerated but essential. They were Nosgoth's first and truest guardians. And then came the war with the Hyaldan, a schism. The Hyaldan were another race, contemporary with the ancient vampires. We know frustratingly little about them, about what they looked like in their original forms, about their culture before everything fell apart. What we do know is this: they rejected the wheel of fate. In Nosgoth, death was not meant to be an ending. Souls were meant to pass through the wheel of fate, to be reborn, to continue the cycle. The ancient vampires accepted this. They built their entire worldview around it. Life, death, rebirth, all part of the natural order maintained by the pillars. But the Hyaldan refused. They saw the wheel not as salvation but as a prison. They did not want to be reborn. They did not want to surrender themselves to a cycle they had no control over. And so they turned away from it, sought to escape it, perhaps sought to destroy it entirely. This was heresy to the ancient vampires. Not just a difference of philosophy, but a fundamental rejection of the natural order they had sworn to protect. The two races went to war. We don't know how long that war lasted. We don't know the details of the battles, the strategies, the individual tragedies that must have accumulated over what might have been centuries of conflict. But we know how it ended. The ancient vampires won. And in their victory, they chose not to destroy the Hyaldan, but to banish them. To cast them out of Nosgoth entirely, into another dimension, the demon realm. And to ensure they could never return, the ancient vampires raised or repurposed the pillars themselves as a barrier, a dimensional lock that could not be opened from the other side. The Hyaldan were sealed away. The war was over. But the Hyaldan did not go quietly into their exile. The curse, bloodthirst, and sterility. In their final moments before the barrier closed, the Hyaldan struck back. Not with armies, not with weapons, with something far more insidious. They cursed the ancient vampires. Two curses, actually. Twin afflictions designed not to kill, but to ensure a slower, crueler fate. The first curse was bloodthirst. The ancient vampires had never been parasites before. They had never needed to feed on other living beings to survive. But now, suddenly, they burned with an unquenchable hunger. Not for food. For blood. Living blood, taken from thinking, feeling creatures. It transformed them, almost overnight, from stewards into predators. From guardians into monsters. The very beings who had been entrusted with the care of Nosgoth were now forced to prey upon its inhabitants to survive. Every meal was a violation of the role they had been meant to fulfill. Every feeding was a reminder of what they had lost. But the second curse was worse, in its way. The Hyaldan made the ancient vampires sterile. They could no longer reproduce. A race that had endured for ages, that had been meant to watch over Nosgoth for all time, was suddenly mortal in the truest sense. Not individually, they could still live for centuries, perhaps forever if they avoided violence. But as a species, they were doomed. There would be no new generation. No children to pass their knowledge to. No future beyond the individuals who currently existed. The ancient vampires were not destroyed. They were doomed to slow extinction. To watch themselves die out, one by one, over the course of centuries, knowing that each death brought their entire race one step closer to oblivion. And the cruel genius of it was this: the curses turned them into exactly what they had always stood against. They became creatures of violence and hunger, forced to kill to live, unable to create life to replace what was lost. The Hyaldan had made them into monsters, and in doing so, had ensured that even in defeat, they would have their revenge. The Pillars passed to humans, a desperate transition. The ancient vampires tried to continue their role as guardians of the Pillars. For a time, they persisted, even cursed, even slowly dying out, still attempting to maintain the balance they had always protected. But it became clear that they could not sustain this indefinitely. They were sterile. Their numbers would only decrease. Eventually, the last ancient vampire would die, and if the Pillars were still bound to vampiric guardians, there would be no one to replace them. The Pillars could not be left unattended. The world depended on them. And so, the guardianship passed to humanity. We don't know exactly how this transition occurred. Was it a choice the ancient vampires made consciously, recognizing their own doom and arranging for successors? Was it something the Pillars themselves decided, sensing the coming extinction of their original stewards? Or was it the work of some other force, some intelligence operating behind the scenes, manipulating events toward this outcome? What we do know is that it happened. The Pillars began choosing human guardians. And the ancient vampires, who had once been essential to the world's function, found themselves replaced. Imagine that. Imagine serving a purpose for longer than human civilization has existed. Imagine being fundamentally woven into the structure of reality itself. And then imagine being told, or simply realizing, that you are no longer needed. That your role has been given to another, younger, shorter-lived race. A race that, from your perspective, has barely existed for any time at all. The ancient vampires became obsolete, redundant. Their purpose taken from them, their future already lost to the Hyaldan curse, they found themselves adrift in a world they had once protected but which no longer required their protection. Some retreated. Some went mad. Some simply waited for the end, for the extinction that was now mathematically inevitable. And slowly, over centuries, they died. One by one. Until there was only one left. Janos Audron, the last ancient. His name is Janos Audron, and he is the last of the ancient vampires. Not the strongest, necessarily. Not the wisest, though he carries more knowledge than any human library could contain. But simply the one who survived longest. The final member of a race that was meant to endure forever. He lives in the Eyrie, a retreat high in the mountains, far from the humans who now hold the Pillars, far from the world that has moved on without his kind. He is a scholar, a keeper of history, a living monument to everything the ancient vampires once were. And he is alone. Utterly, completely alone, in a way that is difficult for us to fully comprehend. Imagine outliving your entire species. Imagine being the only one left who remembers what your people were before the curse. The only one who remembers the war. The only one who knows what the pillars were truly meant to be. Everyone you ever knew is dead. Every contemporary, every friend, every rival, gone. And you persist, carrying all of that history, all of that memory, with no one to share it with. Janos is not bitter, despite everything. He is not vengeful or cruel. In fact, he remains remarkably true to what the ancient vampires were meant to be. A guardian, a protector, someone who cares deeply about Nosgoth and its continued survival. But he is also tragic, in the deepest sense. Because he represents not just an individual, but the end of something that was supposed to last forever. He is a living reminder of what was lost. Of what the Hyaldan curse accomplished. Of how completely a race can be destroyed, not through violence, but through time and sterility and slow, inevitable decline. When Janos eventually dies, and he will die, as all things must, the ancient vampires will be truly extinct. There will be no one left who remembers them firsthand. Their history will become legend. Their purpose will be forgotten. And the world they were meant to protect will continue on without them, unaware of what it lost. Vampires, not monsters, but punished. So when we speak of vampires in the Legacy of Kain series, we must hold two truths simultaneously. Yes, they are predators. Yes, they are dangerous. Yes, they feed on blood and live in the shadows and commit acts of violence. But they are also victims. They are a punished race. They were cursed for winning a war they believed they had to fight. They were transformed into the very thing they had stood against. And they were doomed to extinction for the crime of protecting the world they had been entrusted to maintain. The vampires you encounter in these games, Kain, Raziel, the members of Kain's vampire clan, none of them are ancient vampires. They are something else, something newer, something created rather than born. But they exist in the shadow of this history, whether they know it or not. They are inheritors of a curse they did not earn. They are playing out the final movements of a tragedy that began long before they existed. They are predators, yes, but they are also the descendants, in a sense, of guardians who were punished for doing what they thought was right. This is the emotional core of the series. This is why the vampires are not simply villains to be destroyed. They are tragic figures, caught in a cycle of violence and doom that was set in motion thousands of years before the first game even begins. The ancient vampires were meant to protect Nosgoth forever. Instead, they were cursed, replaced, and driven to extinction. And in their absence, the pillars passed to humans, who proved just as fallible, just as capable of corruption. Which brings us full circle, back to the present, back to the corrupted circle, back to a world held together by 9 poison pillars and a barrier that is slowly failing. The ancient vampires tried to save Nosgoth. They succeeded, for a time. And then they were punished for it, transformed into monsters, and condemned to die out slowly while the world they saved forgot they had ever been its protectors. This is the original sin of Nosgoth. Not Ariel's murder. Not Nupraptor's madness. But the moment the Hyaldan curse landed. The moment the ancient vampires were transformed from guardians into predators. The moment a race meant to endure forever was given an expiration date. Everything that follows, every war, every betrayal, every drop of blood spilled, is built on that foundation. The world is wounded, and it has been wounded for far longer than anyone alive remembers. Act 3. Humans, Seraphan, and the False Holy War. The pillars passed to humanity. The ancient vampires faded into history, then into legend, then into nothing at all. And humanity, newly charged with maintaining the balance of the world, built their own civilizations, their own histories, their own myths. And in those myths, vampires became monsters. Nothing more. It's easy to understand why. The ancient vampires were gone. What remained were the cursed ones, the blood drinkers, the predators who stalked human settlements in the dark. Humanity had no memory of vampires as guardians. They only knew vampires as threats. And so, inevitably, humans decided to do something about it. The rise of the Seraphan, defenders against the dark. They called themselves the Seraphan. A holy order. An army of righteous defenders dedicated to protecting humanity from the vampire menace. They wore white and gold, symbols of purity and divine purpose. They trained as warriors and priests both, combining martial skill with religious fervor. And they hunted vampires. Not with hesitation, not with regret, but with absolute conviction that they were doing holy work. The Seraphan were not a small group of extremists. They were a major military and religious force in Nosgoth, respected and revered by human populations who had every reason to fear vampires. After all, vampires did prey on humans. That was not propaganda. That was simple truth, a consequence of the Hyaldan curse that no one alive remembered or understood. So when the Seraphan promised protection, when they vowed to cleanse the land of the vampire scourge, humanity rallied behind them. They were heroes, protectors, holy warriors standing between innocent people and the creatures that hunted them in the night. And the Seraphan believed it themselves. This is important. They were not cynical. They were not knowingly serving some hidden agenda, at least not most of them. They genuinely believed they were doing righteous work. They saw vampires as evil, as corruption made flesh, as a blight that needed to be eradicated for the good of all. They could not have known that vampires had once been Nosgotha's guardians. That knowledge had been lost centuries ago. They could not have known about the curse, about the Hyaldan, about any of the deeper history that might have complicated their simple narrative of good versus evil. They only knew what they could see. Vampires killed humans. Therefore, vampires must be destroyed. It was a clean narrative, a simple one, and it gave them purpose. The vampire purge, righteousness and genocide. What followed was not a war, not really. It was a purge. The Seraphan did not seek to push vampires back or contain them. They sought to exterminate them entirely, to hunt down every vampire in Nosgoth and destroy them, completely and permanently. No mercy, no prisoners, no exceptions. And they were devastatingly effective. Vampires, for all their power, were few in number. The ancient vampires were already extinct or nearly so. The cursed vampires that remained were scattered, isolated, nowhere near as organized as the Seraphan military machine. They were powerful individually, yes, but the Seraphan had numbers, coordination, divine magic, and most importantly, they had conviction. They believed they were saving the world. And that belief made them relentless. The purge swept across Nosgoth like a holy fire. Vampire strongholds were razed. Covens were destroyed. Ancient crypts were broken open and their inhabitants dragged into the sun. The Seraphan showed no hesitation, no doubt. Every vampire destroyed was a victory for humanity, a step closer to a world free of the blood-drinking menace. And humanity celebrated. Because from their perspective, this was unambiguously good. The monsters were being destroyed. The protectors were winning. The land was being cleansed. They could not see what was really happening. They could not see that they were completing the work the Hyaldan had started millennia ago. The ancient vampires had been cursed into extinction. And now, the vampires that remained, cursed though they were, monstrous though they had become, were being systematically eliminated by the very race that had inherited their role as guardians. It was genocide, but it was genocide carried out by people who believed they were heroes. And that, perhaps, is the cruelest part of all. Raziel, a Seraphan priest. Among the Seraphan, there were individuals who stood out. Warriors and priests whose skill and devotion elevated them above their peers. And one of these was a man named Raziel. He was not the leader of the Seraphan, but he was among their elite, a priest-warrior who embodied everything the order stood for. He was skilled in combat, unwavering in faith, absolutely convinced of the righteousness of his cause. He hunted vampires with zeal and efficiency. He did not question. He did not doubt. He believed. And in believing, he participated in the purge. He destroyed vampires. He probably destroyed many vampires. Each one, from his perspective, was a necessary act, a blow struck against evil, a service to humanity and to the divine purpose he served. Raziel the Seraphan priest was a true believer, a holy warrior, a defender of humanity. He could not have known what would happen to him later. He could not have known that he would die and be resurrected and become the very thing he had spent his human life destroying. He could not have known that he would look back on his time as a Seraphan with horror and recognition, seeing clearly what he could not see then, that he had been a participant in something that was not nearly as righteous as he believed. But that comes later. For now, in this moment of history, Raziel is simply a Seraphan. Devoted, faithful, convinced that he is doing good. And perhaps that is the most tragic thing about him. Not what he becomes, but what he was, and what he believed. Holy defenders manipulated the narrative as a weapon. The Seraphan were not evil. This needs to be stated clearly, because it would be easy to paint them as villains, to make them into simple antagonists. But they were not. They were tools. Someone gave them their purpose. Someone shaped their narrative, pointed them at vampires, and convinced them that this was holy work. Someone cultivated their conviction, their righteousness, their absolute certainty that they were serving a divine cause, and that someone benefited from the purge. The Seraphan believed they were defending humanity, but they were also, unknowingly, serving an agenda that had nothing to do with humanity's well-being. They were pieces on a board, moved by a player they could not see, toward an endgame they could not understand. This is how manipulation works in Nosgoth. Not through mind control, not through obvious villainy, but through narrative, through belief, through giving people a story that makes sense to them, that makes them feel righteous, that gives them purpose and direction. The Seraphan had a simple story. Vampires are evil, we are holy, we must destroy them. And that story was enough. It gave them everything they needed to commit genocide without ever questioning whether they were doing the right thing. They were holy defenders. They were also pawns. Both things can be true simultaneously. And this is a pattern that repeats throughout Nosgoth's history. People acting with conviction, believing they are serving good, righteousness, divine purpose, while actually serving something else entirely. Something older. Something patient. Something that benefits from the chaos and suffering their actions create. The Seraphan destroyed the vampires because they believed it was right. But they were not acting purely on their own initiative. They were being guided, shaped, used. And the one doing the guiding was very, very good at remaining unseen. Mobius, the Time Guardian's true master. His name is Mobius, and he is the guardian of time. One of the Circle of Nine. One of the humans chosen by the Pillars to maintain the balance of Nosgoth. Except that Mobius does not serve the Pillars. He serves the Elder God. The Elder God is something else entirely, something we will delve into more deeply later. But for now, understand this. It is an ancient entity, far older than the Pillars, far older than the vampires or the Hyaldan. It exists outside normal perception, a massive, tentacled creature dwelling in the depths, pulling strings across centuries, manipulating events toward its own ends. And Mobius is its instrument. As the Guardian of Time, Mobius has abilities that go far beyond normal human capacity. He can see through time, manipulate events across centuries, nudge history in specific directions. He has access to knowledge that no one else possesses. He can see the consequences of actions before they happen, can orchestrate outcomes decades or even centuries in advance. And he uses these abilities not to serve the Pillars, not to maintain Nosgoth's balance, but to serve the Elder God's agenda. Mobius was one of the architects of the vampire purge. Not openly. He did not lead Seraphan armies or preach in temples. But he was there, behind the scenes, whispering in the right ears, providing the right information at the right time, shaping the narrative that would turn the Seraphan from a religious order into a genocidal machine. He gave them their purpose. He pointed them at the vampires. And he convinced them it was holy work. The Seraphan believed they were serving some divine force, some higher power that wanted vampires destroyed. And they were not entirely wrong. They were serving a higher power, just not the one they thought. They were serving the Elder God, through Mobius. And the Elder God wanted the vampires destroyed for its own reasons. Reasons that had nothing to do with protecting humanity. Reasons that were, in fact, deeply hostile to Nosgoth's continued survival. Mobius is not loud. He is not bombastic. He does not announce his villainy or cackle over his schemes. He is patient, subtle, and extraordinarily effective. He operates across centuries, setting up dominoes that will fall long after his initial intervention. He is a liar of the highest caliber, capable of convincing entire populations that his agenda is their salvation. And he was corrupted from the beginning. When Nupraptor's madness spread through the circle, it found Mobius already compromised, already serving another master. The corruption did not change his allegiance. It simply made him more effective at pursuing the agenda he had already embraced. He is the Time Guardian, one of the 9 humans meant to protect Nosgoth, and he is actively working to destroy it, while convincing everyone around him that he is doing the opposite. False narratives, true consequences. So the Seraphan carried out their purge. The vampires were destroyed, driven to near extinction. Humanity celebrated. The Seraphan were heroes. Mobius remained in the shadows, his role unrecognized, his true master unknown. And the world became, if anything, more broken. Because the vampires, for all their monstrousness, for all the violence they inflicted, were still connected to Nosgoth's original design. They were the cursed remnants of the ancient vampires, the beings who had been meant to maintain the balance. Destroying them did not heal the world. It removed one of the few remaining links to what the world had been meant to be. But the Seraphan did not know this. They could not have known. They were operating within a narrative that had been carefully constructed for them, a story that cast them as heroes and vampires as irredeemable evil. And they believed it. Completely. Because it made sense. Because it gave them purpose. Because it allowed them to feel righteous while committing atrocities. This is how history is shaped in Nosgoth. Not through grand, obvious evil, but through narrative, through belief, through convincing good people that they are doing good work, even as they serve agendas they cannot see. The Seraphan were holy defenders. They were also tools of the Elder God, used to complete the destruction of a race that had once been Nosgoth's guardians. Raziel was a righteous priest. He was also an instrument of genocide, destroying his own future self's kindred without knowing it. Mobius was a pillar guardian. He was also a traitor, serving an entity that wanted Nosgoth to fall. These contradictions do not cancel each other out. They coexist. They are all true simultaneously. And this is the tragedy of Nosgoth's history. Not that evil triumphs, but that good people, acting with conviction, serve evil without ever realizing it. The Seraphan believed they were saving the world. They were helping to destroy it. And they went to their graves believing they had done the right thing. Act 4. Kain's birth and the first choice. The Seraphan completed their purge. The vampires were broken, scattered, nearly extinct. Mobius continued his quiet manipulations. And the world continued to decay, the pillars continuing to crumble under the weight of the circle's corruption. And into this dying world, a man was born. His name was Kain. He was not remarkable, at first. A human nobleman in the city of Coorigin. Educated. Cynical. Perhaps a bit arrogant, as young nobles often are. He had no connection to the pillars. No grand destiny that he was aware of. He was simply a man, living in a world that was slowly falling apart, unaware of the deeper forces at work. He lived. He walked the streets of his city. He had plans, presumably. A future he imagined for himself. And then, one night, he was murdered. Kain's murder and resurrection, the trap springs. It was not a random act of violence. It was an assassination, carried out by hired killers in a tavern. Kain was cut down, brutally and without ceremony. He died in the dirt, far from home, murdered for reasons he did not understand. His soul should have passed on, should have entered the wheel of fate, been judged, moved on to whatever comes next. But it did not. Instead, something spoke to him. A presence. A voice offering him a choice: remain dead or return to life with the power to avenge himself. A devil's bargain, though Kain did not know yet how true that phrase would prove. He accepted. Of course he accepted. He was angry, bitter, hungry for revenge against those who had killed him. He did not think about the cost. He did not consider what form this resurrection might take. And so Kain was brought back. Not as he was, but as a vampire. He woke in a crypt, transformed. Stronger, faster, immortal, but also cursed with the same affliction that had doomed the ancient vampires, bloodthirst. He burned with hunger, with a need that could only be satisfied by taking the blood of living beings. He was no longer human. He was something else. Something monstrous. And he was filled with rage. The presence that resurrected him was Mortanius, the guardian of death. One of the Circle of Nine. He was the one who pulled Kain's soul back, who transformed him, who set him on this path. But Mortanius was not acting entirely of his own will. Mortanius and the dark entity, a guardian possessed. Mortanius was corrupted, like all the guardians. Nupraptor's madness had infected him along with the rest of the circle. But in Mortanius's case, the corruption went deeper. He was not just twisted. He was possessed. Something else lived inside him. Something old and malevolent that called itself the dark entity, though it had other names, other identities throughout history. It was not Mortanius who orchestrated Kain's murder. It was the dark entity, using Mortanius's body, his power, his position as Death Guardian. The entity wanted Kain dead. And then it wanted him resurrected as a vampire. Not out of mercy, not out of compassion, but because Kain's transformation served a purpose in a much larger plan. Kain did not know this yet. He believed he had been given a gift, however dark. He believed he was in control of his own fate, pursuing his own revenge against those who had killed him. He did not realize he was, from the very beginning, a piece being moved on a board. That his murder, his resurrection, his very existence as a vampire was part of someone else's design. He was a pawn, but he did not know it yet. And so he set out to avenge himself, believing he was acting on his own will. Vorador, the old bloodline endures. In his quest for answers and power, Kain eventually encountered another vampire. An older one. One who remembered things that Kain could not. His name was Vorador. Vorador was not an ancient vampire. He was too young for that, though young is relative when speaking of immortals. But he was old enough to remember the vampire purges. Old enough to have survived the Seraphans' genocide. And he was bitter about it. He lived alone, in a mansion deep in the wilderness, surrounded by the corpses of the Seraphan he had killed over the centuries. He was powerful, sophisticated, cultured, and absolutely unrepentant about what he was. He did not apologize for being a vampire. He did not see himself as a monster. He saw himself as a survivor of a genocide, one of the few remaining representatives of a bloodline that humans had tried to exterminate. He became something of a mentor to Kain. Not a kind one, not a gentle one, but someone who could show Kain what vampires had been, what they could be. Someone who remembered that vampires were not just mindless beasts, but beings with history, culture, power. Vorador had given up on the world, in a sense. He had retreated from it, content to live in isolation and kill any Seraphan foolish enough to hunt him. He had no grand plans, no schemes to restore vampire dominance. He simply endured, a bitter remnant of a race that had been nearly destroyed. But in meeting Kain, something shifted. Here was a newly made vampire, hungry for answers, not yet broken by centuries of isolation and hatred. Someone who might, perhaps, do something other than simply survive. Vorador could not have known what Kain would eventually become, what role he would play. But he gave Kain something valuable, a connection to vampire history. A sense that vampires were more than just monsters. That they had been something before the curse, before the purge, before everything fell apart. He gave Kain context. And context, in Nosgoth, is a dangerous thing. Mobius manipulating Kain, the strings pulled taut. As Kain pursued his revenge, as he grew in power and began to understand what he had become, he encountered Mobius. The Time Guardian presented himself as an ally, a sage. Someone who could help Kain navigate the complex political situation in Nosgoth, who could point him toward those responsible for the decay and corruption plaguing the land. Mobius told Kain about the Circle of Nine, about the corruption spreading through the Guardians. He suggested that if Kain wanted to truly avenge himself, if he wanted to address the rot at the heart of Nosgoth, he would need to confront the Circle directly. And Kain believed him. Because why wouldn't he? Mobius was persuasive, knowledgeable, seemingly sincere. He positioned himself as a reformer, as someone who wanted to fix the broken system but needed a powerful agent to act where he could not. Kain did not know that Mobius was himself part of that corrupted circle, that he served the Elder God. That everything he was telling Kain was true in the details but false in the overall narrative. Mobius was not helping Kain. He was using him, pointing him at specific targets, manipulating him toward specific outcomes. Every piece of advice, every bit of information, every seeming kindness was calculated to move Kain in the direction Mobius wanted him to go. This is what Mobius does. He does not lie outright, or at least, he does not need to. He simply presents truth selectively, shapes the narrative, allows people to draw the conclusions he wants them to draw. And Kain, newly made, angry, hungry for purpose, was an easy target for this kind of manipulation. Mobius set him on a path. And Kain walked it, believing he was acting on his own will. King William and the creation of a martyr. History as a weapon. Among the targets Mobius pointed Kain toward was King William the Just, a beloved ruler who had brought relative peace and prosperity to his kingdom despite the decay spreading through Nosgoth. William was a good king, by all accounts. Fair, just, beloved by his people. Under other circumstances, he might have been exactly the kind of leader Nosgoth needed. But Mobius told Kain that William was corrupt, that he was part of the problem, that his death was necessary for Nosgoth's salvation. And Kain, believing he was striking a blow against corruption, assassinated the king. It was only afterward that Kain began to understand what he had done. William had not been corrupt. He had been one of the few genuinely good people in a position of power. And Kain had murdered him, in public, in a way that made Kain appear to be exactly what humans feared, a vampire monster killing a righteous king. The kingdom erupted in chaos. William's death was not seen as the removal of a corrupt ruler. It was seen as an act of pure evil. A vampire murdering a beloved king. Proof that vampires were monsters that needed to be destroyed. Mobius had turned William into a martyr. And he had turned Kain into the villain of the story. The assassination served multiple purposes. It destabilized the kingdom, creating chaos that Mobius could exploit. It reinforced the narrative that vampires were irredeemable monsters. And it trapped Kain further in the web Mobius was weaving, making him dependent on Mobius's guidance even as that guidance led him deeper into manipulation. Kain began to understand, slowly, that he was being used. That he had been pointed at William deliberately. That nothing about his resurrection, his quest, his actions had been as independent as he believed. He was not the protagonist of his own story. He was a weapon in someone else's hand. And that realization was perhaps more painful than the bloodthirst itself. Kain learns he is the balance guardian, the revelation. But there was more. There was always more. In his confrontations with the Circle, in his growing understanding of the Pillars and their corruption, Kain learned something that changed everything. He was a guardian. Specifically, he was the balance guardian. When Ariel was murdered, her pillar became corrupted, and she remained bound to it as a ghost, unable to fulfill her role. But the pillars still needed a balance guardian. And so, at the moment of Kain's death, his original human death, the pillar of balance chose him as its new guardian. This is why Mortanius resurrected him. This is why the dark entity orchestrated his murder and transformation. Because Kain was meant to be the balance guardian. He was born for that role. And by making him a vampire, by ensuring he could never fulfill that role properly, they had ensured that the pillar of balance would remain corrupted. A vampire cannot be a guardian of the pillars. The pillars were being used as a prison for the Hyaldan, the ancient enemies of vampires. A vampire serving as a guardian would be a fundamental contradiction, an impossibility that the pillars themselves could not accommodate. So Kain was the balance guardian. And he was also a vampire, which meant that balance would remain corrupted for as long as he existed. He was not just a victim of manipulation. He was, by his very existence, part of the problem. His resurrection had been designed to ensure the pillars would continue to decay. And now he understood. He understood that he had been used from the very beginning. That his murder, his resurrection, every choice he had made, had been orchestrated to trap him in this impossible position. He was the balance guardian. And he could never restore balance. The choice to sacrifice or rule, the hinge of fate. But there was, theoretically, a way out. Kain could die. Permanently this time. If he sacrificed himself, if he allowed himself to be destroyed, then the pillar of balance would be free to choose a new guardian. A human guardian. One who could actually fulfill the role properly. His death would restore balance. His death would allow the pillars to heal, would give Nosgoth a chance to recover from the centuries of decay. All he had to do was accept oblivion. Give up his existence. Let himself be erased so that the world could be saved. This was the choice presented to him. Not by Mobius this time, but by Ariel's ghost, bound to the pillar of balance. She explained what he was, what his continued existence meant for Nosgoth, and what his death could accomplish. Sacrifice yourself and save the world, or refuse and condemn it to continued decay. It should have been simple. The heroic choice. The righteous choice. The choice any good person would make without hesitation. But Kain was not a hero. He had never asked to be a hero. He had been murdered, manipulated, used as a pawn in games he did not understand. He had been transformed into a monster and then told that his very existence was a crime against the world. And now he was being asked to die for a world that had given him nothing but suffering. Why should he? Why should he sacrifice himself to save a world that had murdered him, manipulated him, turned him into something he never wanted to be? Why should he give up his existence, his immortality, his power, to restore balance to a system that had been designed to use him and discard him? He looked at the choice before him. Sacrifice or refusal. And he chose refusal. Kain choosing damnation, the world burns. He refused to die. He refused to sacrifice himself for a world that had sacrificed him first. He chose to live, to rule, to take the power that was his by right of survival and use it as he saw fit. If the world would not have him as its balance guardian, then the world could burn. If his existence meant continued decay, then so be it. He had not asked for this burden. He would not bear it. The pillars remained corrupted. Balance was not restored. And Nosgoth continued its slow collapse into ruin. Kain's choice was not made out of cruelty. It was not made out of a desire to watch the world suffer. It was made out of rage, yes, but also out of something more fundamental, a refusal to be sacrificed. A refusal to accept that his existence was inherently wrong. A refusal to play the role he had been assigned in someone else's design. He had been used his entire life, his entire existence as a vampire. He had been murdered to serve a purpose, resurrected to serve a purpose, manipulated toward outcomes that benefited everyone except himself. And when finally given a choice, a real choice, not one engineered by Mobius or the Dark Entity or anyone else, he chose himself. He chose to exist, even if it meant the world's damnation. Even if it meant he was, by his own choice, the reason Nosgoth would continue to die. The hinge of everything. This is the moment that everything else flows from. This is the choice that shapes the rest of the saga. Not Ariel's murder. Not Nupraptor's madness. Not the corruption of the circle. But Kain's refusal to die. He could have been the hero. He could have sacrificed himself, restored balance, saved the world. The story could have ended there, tragically perhaps, but with hope for Nosgoth's future. Instead, Kain chose damnation. His own and the world's. And in doing so, he became something other than a pawn. For the first time in his existence, he acted purely on his own will, in defiance of what he was supposed to do, what he was meant to be. He chose himself over the world, and the world would never forgive him for it. But perhaps more importantly, Kain would never entirely forgive himself, because he understood what he had done. He understood that his choice meant continued suffering for Nosgoth. He understood that he had chosen his own existence over the lives and well-being of countless others. He made the selfish choice, the understandable choice, the human choice, ironically, for a creature who was no longer human. And he would spend the next 1,000 years living with the consequences of that choice, ruling over a world that continued to decay, knowing that he was the reason it could not heal. This is the hinge, the moment where everything changes, where Kain stops being a victim and becomes something else, something more complex, something that cannot be easily categorized as hero or villain. He is the balance guardian who refused to restore balance. He is the one who chose existence over sacrifice. He is the reason the world continues to die. And he knows it. And he lives with it. And the story continues, spiraling outward from this single choice, this moment of refusal, this act of defiance against a fate that demanded his death. Kain chose to live, and Nosgoth paid the price. Act V. Empire, Lieutenants, and Decay. Time passes differently for immortals. For humans, 1,000 years is an unfathomable span. Empires rise and fall. Languages evolve and die. Entire civilizations become dust and memory. But for Kain, 1,000 years is simply existence. A long stretch of nights, one after another, flowing together into a single continuous present. He chose not to die, and so he lived, and lived, and lived. And Nosgoth died around him, slowly, incrementally, rotting from the foundations up. Kain ruling for over a millennium. The long decay. After his refusal to sacrifice himself, after his choice to let the pillars remain corrupted, Kain did not simply disappear into the shadows. He did not hide from what he had done. Instead, he built an empire. If the world would not have him as its balance guardian, then he would be its ruler. If his existence meant decay, then he would rule over that decay, shape it, control it. He would not be passive. He would not apologize. He conquered, systematically, methodically, using his vampiric power, his growing understanding of Nosgoth's deeper structures, his bitter intelligence. He swept across the land, destroying resistance, crushing human kingdoms, establishing dominance. And he succeeded. Not quickly, not easily, but over decades, then centuries, he built a vampire empire with himself at its apex. Humanity was subjugated, reduced to cattle, ruled by an immortal predator they could not defeat. This was not cruelty for its own sake, though there was certainly cruelty in it. This was control. Kain saw himself as Nosgoth's rightful ruler, the one being strong enough and immortal enough to guide the world through its decay. If he could not save it, he could at least rule it, shape it according to his will. But ruling a dying world is not the same as ruling a living one. The decay continued. The pillars remained corrupted, with Kain himself serving as the corrupted balance guardian, his very existence the reason the pillars could not heal. And the corruption in the pillars bled into the land, just as it always had, just as it always would. The seasons became unreliable. The water grew foul. The land itself seemed to sicken, to become twisted and wrong in ways that no amount of vampire dominion could prevent or reverse. Kain ruled, but he ruled over a world that was slowly dying. And there was nothing he could do to stop it, because he was the reason it could not heal. He knew this. He had always known this. His choice had been made with full awareness of what it meant. And so he ruled, for century after century, over an empire built on a foundation of decay, watching the world slowly crumble while maintaining absolute control over that crumbling. Powerful, immortal, utterly alone in his understanding of what his existence meant. 1,000 years. More than 1,000 years. Time stretched out, and Kain endured. But even immortals cannot rule alone. Creation of the 6 lieutenants, companionship and hierarchy. At some point in his long rule, Kain decided he needed others. Not equals, he had no equals. But subordinates. Powerful ones. Vampires who could serve as generals, administrators, enforcers of his will across the vast empire he had built. He could not simply turn any human into a vampire and expect them to serve adequately. Vampirism was not a simple transformation. It required strength of will, intelligence, capability. And finding humans with those qualities, humans worthy of the dark gift, was not easy. But Kain was patient. And over time, he found them. 6 humans. Each one exceptional in their own way. Each one chosen deliberately, carefully, for qualities that Kain valued. Warriors. Leaders. Thinkers. People who had proven themselves capable even in their mortal lives. Kain transformed them, gave them immortality, power, purpose. He raised them as his lieutenants, his generals, the executors of his will throughout Nosgoth. They were not his children, not exactly. Vampires do not reproduce in any conventional sense, not after the Hyaldan curse. But in a real sense, they were the closest thing to progeny that Kain would ever have. He had made them what they were. And in return, They served him with absolute loyalty. For a time. Because vampires are not static. They change. They evolve. And what Kain created, he could not entirely control. Raziel, firstborn and general. Among the six, one stood above the others. Not in power necessarily, though he was powerful, but in the order of creation. The first of Kain's lieutenants. The eldest of the vampire bloodline that Kain had established. His name was Raziel. Yes. The same Raziel who had once been a Seraphan priest. The same Raziel who had hunted vampires in his mortal life, who had participated in the purges, who had believed absolutely in the righteousness of destroying Kain's kind. He did not remember this. When Kain raised him as a vampire, Raziel had no memory of his human life. He did not know he had once been Seraphan. He did not know he had once hunted the very thing he had become. That knowledge had been taken from him, or perhaps simply lost in the transformation. All he knew was his existence as Kain's first lieutenant, his role as general of the vampire armies, his position at the head of Kain's hierarchy. Raziel was exceptional, brilliant strategist, charismatic leader, absolutely devoted to Kain. He served without question, without hesitation, carrying out Kain's will with ruthless efficiency. He conquered territories in Kain's name. He crushed rebellions. He maintained order throughout the empire. And Kain favored him. Not with affection, perhaps. Kain was not capable of affection, not anymore. But with respect. With recognition of Raziel's capabilities. With trust, insofar as Kain was capable of trusting anyone. Raziel was first. First raised. First in hierarchy. First in Kain's regard. And that position, that primacy, would eventually become his downfall. But for now, for centuries, Raziel served faithfully. He was the general of the vampire empire, the enforcer of Kain's order, the right hand of the emperor. And he believed, absolutely, that he was serving something greater than himself. The six clans, evolution and mutation. Kain's lieutenants were not simply individuals. Each one became the progenitor of a clan. Because while vampires could not reproduce naturally, they could create more vampires. And each lieutenant, in turn, raised their own progeny, building bloodlines that descended from them. 6 lieutenants. 6 clans. Raziel's clan, the Razielim, were the eldest, the most disciplined, often serving as officers and administrators throughout the empire. Tural's clan were warriors, brutal and direct. Duma's clan were zealots, religious in their devotion to Kain's rule. Rahab's clan adapted to water, learned to swim in Nosgoth's poisoned seas. Zephin's clan became scholars and architects, building the structures of the empire. Melchiah's clan were the youngest, the weakest, often serving as scouts and spies. Each clan took on characteristics that reflected their progenitor, not just in personality, but physically. Because vampires in Nosgoth do not remain static. They evolve. They mutate. They adapt to their environments and purposes in ways that change their very physical form. This was not intentional. Kain had not designed his lieutenants to spawn distinct bloodlines with unique characteristics. But it happened anyway, a consequence of vampiric nature, or perhaps a consequence of Nosgoth's decay affecting even the vampires who ruled over it. The clans grew over centuries. Populations of vampires, each one descended from one of the 6 lieutenants, each clan developing its own culture, its own fighting style, its own mutations and adaptations. They were not all equal. The Razielim, as the eldest, held the most prestige. The Melchiah, as the youngest, were often looked down upon, pitted for their weakness. But all served Kain. All maintained the empire. And all slowly changed, generation by generation, becoming more monstrous, more adapted to the dying world they inhabited. Clan territories, landscapes of rot. Each clan was given territory to rule. Domains within the larger empire where they held absolute authority, where they maintained order in Kain's name. And each territory reflected the decay spreading through Nosgoth. The Razielim held the heights, the mountain strongholds, places of stone and discipline where the air grew thin and cold. Tural's territory was straightforward, militaristic, fortified positions and training grounds. Duma's clan ruled over what had once been holy lands, cathedrals and temples now defiled, repurposed to worship Kain instead of whatever gods humans had once prayed to. Rahab's clan claimed the coastlands, the drowned places where Nosgoth's seas had become toxic but navigable for vampires who had adapted to the poison. Zephin's clan built their domain underground, vast networks of caverns and tunnels, places where the twisted architecture reflected their increasingly inhuman forms. Melchia's clan was given the wastelands, the places too decayed for anyone else to want, the rotting fringes of the empire. Each territory was marked by decay. Not the simple decay of neglect, but something deeper, more fundamental. The land itself was wrong, twisted, as if Nosgoth's sickness had progressed from mere corruption into active mutation. The trees grew at wrong angles. The water carried colors it should not have. The very stone seemed to pulse with unwholesome life in some places, to crumble into dust in others. The sky was perpetually overcast, the sun a dim memory even in daytime, the world locked in a permanent twilight. This was not the result of vampire rule, not directly. This was the pillars continuing to decay, the world's foundations continuing to crumble, the inevitable consequence of Kain's choice made 1,000 years ago. The vampires ruled over this, maintained order within it, but they could not stop it. They could not heal it. They could only exist within it, adapting to the decay, becoming part of it themselves. Kain ruling from the broken pillars, the seat of power. And at the center of it all, Kain ruled from the pillars themselves. He did not hide from what he was, did not pretend the pillars were anything other than monuments to corruption. He built his seat of power there, at the very place where Nosgoth's decay originated, where the world's foundations crumbled, where Ariel's ghost remained bound, watching helplessly as the world died. The pillars were cracked, visibly deteriorating. They no longer shone with the light they had once emanated. Instead, they pulsed with a sickly luminescence, wrong colors, energies that felt fundamentally corrupted. Kain sat there, in the shadow of the breaking pillars, ruling his empire. A monument to his refusal. A constant reminder of the choice he had made. He did not feel guilt, not exactly. Kain was beyond guilt by this point. Too old, too powerful, too far removed from human emotion. But he felt something. Recognition, perhaps. Awareness of what his existence meant. Understanding of the price the world was paying for his continued life. And he accepted it. Had accepted it from the beginning. This was the world he had chosen. This was the empire he had built. This was the decay he perpetuated simply by existing. From the pillars, he commanded his lieutenants, shaped his empire, watched the slow unfolding of Nosgoth's death over the course of centuries. Absolute power, absolute control, absolute awareness of the futility of it all. Because he could rule, yes. He could conquer, maintain order, shape civilizations according to his will. But he could not save the world. He could not heal the pillars. He could not undo the choice he had made 1,000 years ago. He could only rule over the consequences. Endure them. Watch them unfold with the patience of an immortal who has long since given up on redemption. The empire at its height. A frozen moment. For a time, centuries, perhaps, the empire was stable. The clans maintained their territories. The lieutenants served faithfully. Humanity was subjugated but not exterminated, maintained as a necessary resource for vampire sustenance. Order prevailed, of a sort. It was not peace. It was not prosperity. But it was stability. Kain ruled from the pillars. His 6 lieutenants commanded their clans. The world continued to decay, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, at a rate that allowed the vampires to adapt, to maintain their civilization even as the world beneath it crumbled. It could have continued indefinitely. An eternal twilight empire, unchanging, slowly dying but never quite dead, preserved in a state of suspended decay like an insect trapped in amber. But nothing is eternal in Nosgoth. Not even vampires. Because the lieutenants continued to evolve. Continued to change. And evolution, especially in a decaying world, does not always proceed in predictable directions. The clans began to diverge further. Their mutations became more pronounced. Their differences more stark. And at the head of them all, Raziel, the firstborn, began to change in a way that would shatter the empire's stability forever. He developed something new. Something none of the other lieutenants had achieved. He grew wings. Act 6. Raziel's Fall and Rebirth. For centuries, Raziel had been first raised. First in Kain's hierarchy. First in evolution, always one step ahead of his brothers in the mutations and adaptations that all vampires underwent. This was natural. Expected. He was the eldest. Of course he would evolve faster, change more dramatically. The other lieutenants accepted this, even if some resented it. Raziel was first. That was simply how things were. But then he evolved beyond what any vampire had achieved before. He grew wings. Raziel's wings. Evolution beyond permission. They emerged slowly at first. Bone and membrane pushing through the flesh of his back. Painful, certainly. Transformative. But also magnificent. When they were fully formed, Raziel could fly. Not glide, not float, but truly fly. He could soar above Nosgoth's dying landscape, could traverse his territory with a freedom that no other vampire possessed. He could rise above the decay, if only temporarily, if only physically. It was a remarkable evolution. A testament to his nature as firstborn, as the vampire closest to Kain in power and age. He had surpassed his brothers in a way that was undeniable, visible, impossible to ignore. He was proud of it. Of course he was. This was evidence of his superiority, confirmation of his position at the head of Kain's hierarchy. He had achieved something none of the others had. He had evolved beyond them. He did not think about what it meant, did not consider how Kain might perceive this development. He should have, because Raziel had made a terrible mistake. He had evolved beyond what Kain had permitted. More than that, he had evolved in a way that Kain himself had not achieved. Kain did not have wings. Kain, the Emperor, the progenitor of all their bloodlines, the most powerful vampire in Nosgoth, could not fly. And now his first lieutenant, his supposed subordinate, had developed an ability that surpassed him in this one specific, visible way. It was not a challenge. Raziel had not intended it as defiance. He had simply evolved. It was natural, inevitable, the result of centuries of existence and the mutations that all vampires underwent. But Kain did not see it that way. His execution in the abyss, the Father's wrath. Kain summoned his lieutenants. All 6 of them gathered before him at the pillars. An audience. A judgment. And then, without ceremony, without explanation, Kain tore the wings from Raziel's back. Not cleanly. Not mercifully. He ripped them away, bone and membrane tearing, leaving Raziel bleeding and broken before his brothers. A demonstration. A punishment. A reminder of who held absolute power in this empire. Raziel did not understand. He had served faithfully for centuries. He had done everything Kain had asked. He had evolved, yes, but that was natural, inevitable, not a crime. But Kain saw it differently. Saw it as presumption, as overstepping, as evolution beyond what Kain had granted permission for. And so Raziel was sentenced. Not to simple death. Kain could have destroyed him completely if he chose. But to something worse. He was cast into the abyss. The abyss was a massive whirlpool at the base of the pillars, a churning vortex of water that descended into depths that seemed to have no bottom. It was where Nosgoth's decay was most visible, most concentrated. A wound in the world, spiraling downward into nothing. Raziel was thrown in. His brothers watched. Kain watched. And Raziel fell, wingless, powerless, into the dark water. He did not die immediately. Vampires are resilient, difficult to kill. But the water was not normal water. It was the lake of the dead, and it did things to vampires that normal water could not. He sank, and sank, and sank. And as he descended into the depths, into the crushing darkness, into the suffocating embrace of the poisoned water, Raziel's body began to dissolve. Not quickly, not mercifully, but slowly, agonizingly, his flesh sloughing away, his bones exposed, his physical form disintegrating piece by piece as the lake consumed him. He drowned, not in the sense of suffocation, but in the sense of being unmade. His body destroyed, his existence unraveled. Everything he was, torn apart by the water that filled the abyss. And he should have died. should have been destroyed completely, should have ceased to exist. But he did not. The Lake of the Dead, where souls dissolve. The Lake of the Dead was aptly named. It was not simply water. It was a place where the boundary between the physical and spiritual realms had worn thin, where death itself had pooled and concentrated, where souls went to be unmade. Raziel sank into its depths. His body destroyed. His flesh gone. His bones breaking apart. Everything physical about him dissolved, consumed by the lake. But his soul remained, trapped, unable to move on, unable to die completely. He existed in a state of pure suffering, conscious, aware, but without form, without body, without any way to act or escape or end his agony. Just awareness, floating in the depths, experiencing the dissolution of everything he had been. Time had no meaning here. He could have been in this state for moments or centuries. There was no way to measure it, no way to track the passage of existence when existence itself had been reduced to pure suffering consciousness. He was being unmade, slowly, completely, and he was aware of every moment of it. This was Kain's punishment, not death, but unmaking, dissolution, an eternity of being destroyed without ever quite ceasing to exist. Raziel's thoughts, such as they were consumed with betrayal, with incomprehension. He had served faithfully. He had been loyal. And Kain had destroyed him for the crime of evolution, for developing wings, for surpassing his master in one small way. It was not justice. It was not reasonable. It was simply power, exercised without mercy, without explanation. And Raziel suffered, and continued to suffer, trapped in the depths of the Lake of the Dead, unable to die, unable to escape, unable to do anything but experience his own dissolution. Until something found him. The elder god reviving him, the false salvation. A presence. Vast. Ancient. Incomprehensible in scope. It spoke to him, not with words exactly, but with impressions, with concepts that bypassed language and entered directly into whatever remained of Raziel's consciousness. It called itself the elder god. And it offered him a choice that was not really a choice at all. Continue dissolving. Continue suffering. Remain trapped in this state forever. Or accept resurrection. Be given form again. Be allowed to exist, to act, to escape the lake. In exchange for service. Raziel did not hesitate. How could he? He had been suffering for an unmeasurable span of time, experiencing the slow unmaking of his very soul. Any alternative was preferable. Any escape from this torment was worth whatever price might be demanded. He accepted, and the elder god pulled him from the lake. Not completely, not entirely, but enough. Enough to give him form again. Enough to allow him to exist outside the pure agony of dissolution. But the form he was given was not his original body. That had been destroyed, consumed by the lake, irretrievable. Instead, he was given a new existence. A spectral one. Raziel was reborn as a wraith. A spirit given form. No longer truly physical, but no longer purely ethereal either. Something in between. Something new. He emerged from the Lake of the Dead changed. Transformed. No longer the vampire he had been. No longer Kain's lieutenant. No longer even truly alive in any conventional sense. He was something else now. Something that existed between states. Between life and death. Between physical and spiritual. And the elder god informed him of his purpose. His new role in this new existence. He was to be an agent. A hunter. Specifically, he was to hunt and destroy vampires. To consume their souls. To feed the cycle of death and rebirth that the elder god claimed to maintain. The irony was not lost on Raziel. He had been a vampire. He had ruled as one of Kain's lieutenants. And now he was being tasked with destroying his former kind. But the elder god framed this as justice. As balance. The vampires had upset the natural order, had refused their place in the wheel of fate, had persisted beyond their proper time. Raziel would be the instrument of correction, would restore the balance by ending their unnatural existence. And Raziel, newly resurrected, betrayed by Kain, filled with rage and incomprehension at what had been done to him, accepted this narrative. He would hunt vampires. He would destroy his former brothers. And he would eventually confront Kain himself, the one who had cast him into the abyss. The elder god had saved him, given him purpose, given him a reason to continue existing. He did not yet understand that he had simply traded one master for another, that the elder god was no more trustworthy than Kain had been, that he was, once again, being used as a pawn in a much larger game. But he would understand. Eventually. For now, he simply accepted his new existence, his new purpose, his new form. He was Raziel. He had been firstborn. Then he had been executed. And now he was reborn. And everything he had been before was gone. The spectral versus material realms, existing between. Raziel's new existence was divided. He did not exist solely in the physical world anymore. Instead, he moved between two realms, the material and the spectral. The material realm was Nosgoth as it appeared to living beings. Solid, physical, the dying world of stone and flesh and decay that he had known as a vampire. The spectral realm was something else. It was Nosgoth as seen from the other side of death. A mirror of the physical world, but twisted, degraded, showing the true spiritual corruption that underlay the material decay. Buildings appeared as ruins. The land was even more twisted. And everywhere, souls lingered, the dead who had not moved on, trapped in the spectral realm, unable or unwilling to pass through the wheel of fate. Raziel existed in both. He could shift between them, moving from material to spectral and back again. In the material realm, he could interact with physical objects, could fight vampires, could affect the world directly. In the spectral realm, he was safer from harm but also less able to affect physical reality. This dual existence was both a gift and a curse. He could navigate Nosgoth in ways that no living being could escape danger by shifting realms, could access places that were impossible to reach in only one state of being. But he was also trapped between states. Not truly alive, not truly dead, not vampire, not human, not ghost. Something unprecedented. Something that existed in the cracks between categories. He was conscious of both realms simultaneously, to some degree, could feel the pull of the spectral even while existing in the material, could sense the physical world even while drifting through the realm of spirits. It was disorienting, isolating. He was separated from everything he had known by a barrier that was not distance but state of being. He could see his former empire, his former brothers, but he was no longer part of their world. He existed adjacent to it, able to observe and interact but never truly belong. Raziel's immortality as a wraith, beyond death. But there was one aspect of his new existence that was perhaps more significant than any other. He could not die, not in any permanent sense. As a vampire, he had been difficult to kill, resilient, long-lived. But he could have been destroyed. With enough damage, enough violence, his existence could have been ended. As a wraith, this was no longer true. If his spectral form was damaged enough, if he took too much harm in the material realm, he would be forcibly pulled back into the spectral realm. His form would dissolve, he would lose cohesion, and he would find himself dragged back to the lake of the dead, to the depths of the abyss where he had been reborn. There, in the lake, he would reconstitute. Slowly, painfully, his form rebuilding itself from nothing. And then he would emerge again, whole, ready to continue. He could be defeated. He could be forced to retreat. But he could not be permanently destroyed. This was the gift the elder god had given him. True immortality. Not the immortality of vampires, which was simply extended life. But actual immortality. The inability to cease existing. It meant he could attempt things that would be suicide for any other being. Could take risks that no vampire would dare, could pursue his hunt without fear of permanent death. But it also meant he was trapped. Forever. He could not choose to stop existing. Could not opt out of this existence the elder god had forced upon him. He was bound to continue, to persist, to exist whether he wanted to or not. He was immortal. And immortality, in this case, was another form of imprisonment. The wraith awakens, a new purpose. Raziel emerged from the Lake of the Dead into a Nosgoth that had continued without him. He did not know how long he had been in the abyss. Time had no meaning in that place of dissolution. But in the physical world, centuries had passed. Perhaps 500 years. Perhaps more. The empire he had served had continued. His brothers still ruled their territories. Kain still sat at the pillars, maintaining his dominion over the dying world. But everything had changed. The decay had progressed. The clans had evolved further. And Raziel was no longer part of any of it. He was outside it now. Separate. A wraith wandering through a world that had moved on without him. And he was filled with purpose. Dark purpose. Vengeful purpose. He would hunt his former brothers. Would destroy them, consume their souls, tear down the empire he had helped build. And eventually, he would confront Kain. Would face the one who had destroyed him, who had cast him into the abyss for the crime of evolution. The Elder God had given him this mission. Had framed it as justice, as the restoration of natural order. But for Raziel, it was simpler than that. It was revenge. He had been firstborn. He had been loyal. He had served faithfully for centuries. And he had been destroyed for it. Now he would return that destruction. Would tear down everything Kain had built. Would make him understand what he had done. Raziel did not yet understand the deeper currents at work. Did not know about the Elder God's true nature. Did not realize he was being used, manipulated, pointed at targets that served an agenda he could not see. He only knew betrayal and rage, and the cold comfort of having a purpose, however dark, in a new existence that was otherwise defined by isolation and loss. He was Raziel, no longer vampire, no longer lieutenant, no longer anything he had been before. He was a wraith, an agent of vengeance, a soul reaver, though he did not yet fully understand what that term would come to mean. And he began his hunt through the ruins of the empire he had once helped rule, moving between realms, consuming souls, growing stronger with each vampire he destroyed. The firstborn had returned, changed, transformed, no longer serving Kain, but serving something else. Something that had its own designs for Nosgoth's future. Something that had been waiting, patiently, for exactly this opportunity. Act 7. The Soul Reaver Paradox. As Raziel hunted through the ruins of Kain's empire, destroying his former brothers one by one, he began to learn things. About Nosgoth's deeper history. About the forces that moved beneath the surface of events. About the weapon that would come to define his existence more than anything else. The Soul Reaver. To understand the Soul Reaver, we must first understand where it came from. What it was before it became the legendary blade. Before it became the weapon that would break causality itself. We must go back to something simpler. Something more mundane. The Blood Reaver. The Blood Reaver's origin. A vampire's weapon. The Blood Reaver was Janos Audrin's sword. Janos, the last of the ancient vampires, the keeper of histories, the one who remembered what vampires had been before the curse. He carried a sword. Not an ornate weapon. Not a ceremonial piece. But a functional blade, well-crafted, designed for combat. It was simply a sword. Made of metal. Forged by hands, vampire or human, in some workshop lost to history. It had no magical properties, no special powers. It was a tool. A weapon that Janos used when weapons were necessary. He called it the Blood Reaver. Perhaps because it was wielded by a vampire. Perhaps because it had tasted blood often enough to earn the name. The origin of the name itself has been lost, one of countless small details that disappear as centuries pass and memories fade. It was Janos's sword, and that was all it was. Until it wasn't, because the Blood Reaver's fate was to become something far more significant. Something that would transcend its origin as a simple weapon. Something that would become central to Nosgoth's entire timeline, to the fate of everyone who had ever lived there. But that transformation required an intervention. Required power. Required someone to take this mundane blade and remake it into something that could devour souls. That someone was Kain. The Soul Reaver, a soul-devouring blade. At some point in his long rule, Kain came into possession of the Blood Reaver. How this happened is unclear. Did he take it from Janos? Was it given? Found? The specifics have been lost or never recorded. What matters is that Kain took this sword and transformed it. Using magics we do not fully understand, drawing on powers that might have been connected to the pillars or to his own vampiric nature or to sources even older, Kain imbued the blade with a terrible purpose. He made it capable of devouring souls. Not simply killing. Any weapon can kill. But the Soul Reaver, as it now became known, did something more profound. When it struck a victim, it did not simply end their physical existence. It consumed their soul entirely, tore it from their body and absorbed it into the blade itself. The victim did not die in any normal sense. They were not just killed. They were unmade. Their soul, the essential spiritual core of their existence, was torn away and trapped within the weapon. They could not pass on, could not enter the wheel of fate, could not move to whatever afterlife or rebirth awaited them. They simply ceased to exist as anything except trapped essence within the blade. This was a weapon of profound cruelty, of absolute annihilation. It did not just end life. It ended existence itself, permanently and completely. And Kain wielded it for centuries, used it to destroy enemies, to consume those who stood against him. The blade grew in power with each soul it devoured, becoming more dangerous, more terrible, a weapon that was as much curse as tool. It became legendary, feared. The Soul Reaver, Kain's blade, the weapon that could end not just life but the very possibility of continuation beyond death. And Kain carried it with him always, a manifestation of his absolute power, his willingness to not just defeat but erase those who opposed him. Until he tried to use it on Raziel. The blade shattering on Raziel, rejection of fate. When Raziel confronted Kain, not immediately upon emerging from the abyss, but later, after hunting through the Empire, after growing in power and understanding, Kain was waiting for him. And Kain wielded the Soul Reaver. It should have been a one-sided fight. Kain was more powerful, more experienced, and he had a weapon that could permanently destroy even a wraith, could consume Raziel's soul and end his existence completely. Raziel should have been erased, devoured, ended. But when Kain struck him with the Soul Reaver, when the blade connected with Raziel's spectral form, something impossible happened. The blade shattered, not damaged, not chipped or broken in some ordinary way, but shattered completely, exploding into fragments. The soul-devouring power that Kain had imbued into it suddenly and violently rejected. The blade that could consume any soul, that had devoured countless beings over centuries, that represented Kain's ultimate power, broke on Raziel. Kain was shocked. Raziel was shocked. The weapon had been destroyed by the very act of trying to consume him. It made no sense. Raziel was powerful, yes, but not more powerful than Kain. He should not have been able to resist the blade, should not have been able to break it simply by being struck by it. But he did. The Soul Reaver shattered, and Kain was left holding nothing but a hilt. The blade itself exploded into fragments that scattered across the battlefield. Neither of them understood what had happened. Why the blade had rejected Raziel specifically. Why attempting to consume his soul had resulted in the weapon's destruction. The answer would come later. Much later, and it would reveal a truth about Raziel's nature that neither of them had suspected. But in that moment, there was only confusion, and the wreckage of a legendary weapon, and Kain's recognition that something about Raziel was fundamentally different from anything he had anticipated. The Wraith Blade forming, a weapon bound to soul. After the Soul Reaver shattered, after the confrontation with Kain ended with neither combatant truly victorious, Raziel discovered something extraordinary. The fragments of the Soul Reaver were not simply destroyed. They had not disappeared. Instead, they had become part of him. The soul-devouring power that had been imbued in the blade, that essence which had consumed countless souls over centuries, had transferred to Raziel himself. Or perhaps bonded with him. Or perhaps recognized something in him that drew it in. Raziel found that he could manifest a blade. Not a physical weapon that he carried, but something that emerged from his own arm, his own spectral form, taking the shape of a sword made of spectral energy. The Wraith Blade. It did not look exactly like the Soul Reaver had. It was less ornate, more raw, clearly spectral rather than physical. But it functioned similarly. When Raziel struck enemies with it, it consumed their souls, drew them into itself, fed on their spiritual essence. The power that Kain had wielded through an external weapon, Raziel now wielded as an extension of his own being. The blade was him. He was the blade. There was no separation between weapon and wielder, and it was powerful, terribly powerful. With the Wraithblade, Raziel could destroy vampires permanently, could consume the souls of his former brothers, could tear down the empire that had rejected him. But there was something strange about it, something that Raziel noticed but could not fully understand. The blade felt familiar, not just because it had been the Soul Reaver, but in some deeper way, as if he had always been meant to wield it, as if the connection between himself and this weapon predated his transformation into a wraith, predated his execution, predated everything. As if, somehow, the blade was not just bound to him but was in some fundamental way part of his destiny. He did not understand this feeling, could not explain it, but it was there, constant, a sense of recognition that went deeper than memory. The Wraithblade was his, had always been his, in some sense that transcended linear time. And that impossible familiarity was the first clue to a much larger truth. Raziel as a living paradox, the answer revealed. The truth, when it finally emerged, was this. Raziel was the Soul Reaver, not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally. At some point in the future, or perhaps in a past that had been overwritten, or in a timeline that no longer existed but still cast shadows, Raziel himself had been bound into the blade. His soul, his essence, his entire being had been trapped within the weapon, transformed into the soul-devouring power that gave the Soul Reaver its terrible function. The blade that Kain had wielded for centuries was not just imbued with power. It was imbued with Raziel. Raziel's soul, corrupted and transformed, had been the source of the weapon's ability to consume other souls. When Kain struck Raziel with the Soul Reaver, the blade had not simply encountered another soul to devour. It had encountered itself. Raziel's soul meeting Raziel's soul, the paradox of the same being existing in two states simultaneously. And reality could not accommodate that. The blade shattered because it could not consume itself. Because the paradox was too fundamental, too absolute, for even a soul-devouring weapon to resolve. Raziel was a living paradox, a being who existed simultaneously as himself and as the weapon that was meant to destroy him. He was both the hunter and the hunted, both the soul and the soul-devourer. His very existence violated causality, broke the normal rules of how time and fate operated in Nosgoth. He was an impossibility made flesh, or made wraith, more accurately, and that impossibility was central to everything that would happen going forward. The Wraithblade he now wielded was an echo of this truth, a reflection of what he would become, or had become, or was in the process of becoming. The blade was him. He was the blade, not metaphorically, literally. And this paradox, this fundamental violation of causality, made him perhaps the most important being in Nosgoth. Because if he was a paradox, if his existence defied the normal rules of time and fate, then he had the potential to change things that should be unchangeable, to alter history, to break the cycle, to defy the destiny that had been written into Nosgoth's very foundations. Multiple Reavers existing at once, causality unraveling. The paradox did not stop with Raziel alone. As he traveled through time, something that became possible later, through means we will discuss eventually, Raziel encountered the Soul Reaver in multiple forms simultaneously. There was the physical blade that Kain wielded, the weapon as it existed in the material world, before it shattered, during the centuries when it was simply a sword imbued with soul-devouring power. There was the Wraithblade that Raziel carried, the spectral manifestation, the power bound to his arm, the echo of what the blade would become. And there was Raziel himself, the living paradox, the being whose soul would eventually be bound into the weapon, creating the very power that defined it. Three versions of the Soul Reaver, three states of the same impossible weapon, all existing simultaneously, occupying the same timeline, interacting with each other in ways that should have torn causality apart. The physical blade that would eventually contain Raziel's soul, the Wraithblade that was already an expression of that binding, And Raziel himself, not yet trapped but destined to be. Cause and effect became meaningless. How could the blade exist before Raziel was bound into it? How could Raziel wield the blade that was himself? How could the weapon contain his soul if his soul was still free? There were no good answers to these questions. The Soul Reaver existed in a state of temporal paradox, its past and future tangled together in ways that violated everything about how time was supposed to work. And yet it persisted. All three versions of it persisted, simultaneously, without resolution. Nosgoth's timeline bent around this impossibility. Reality warped to accommodate it. The paradox became part of the world's structure, as fundamental as the pillars themselves, as inescapable as the decay that spread from them. The weapon-stabilizing time paradoxes, the anchor point. But here is the strange thing about the Soul Reaver's paradox. It did not destroy the timeline, did not cause reality to collapse under the weight of its own impossibility. Instead, it stabilized things. The Soul Reaver, in all its forms, existing simultaneously, became an anchor point, a fixed element around which time could flow, even when that flow became turbulent, even when paradoxes threatened to unravel everything. Other temporal impossibilities could exist in proximity to the Soul Reaver because the Soul Reaver was already the greatest impossibility. It had already broken causality so thoroughly that nothing else could break it further. In a sense, the weapon's paradox created a space where other paradoxes could exist, where time could be changed without immediately snapping back, where fate could be defied without reality immediately correcting itself. Raziel, as the living embodiment of this paradox, became capable of doing things that should have been impossible. He could travel through time without creating obvious contradictions, could alter events without immediately triggering cosmic correction, could defy prophecies and destinies that should have been absolute, not because he was more powerful than fate, but because he existed outside the normal rules, because his very existence was a violation that reality had already accommodated, already bent itself around, already accepted as part of its structure. The Soul Reaver was a paradox, and paradoxes, once they achieve a certain scale, create their own stability, become their own justification, exist simply because they already exist, and reality has no mechanism to undo something that has become that fundamentally woven into the fabric of time. Raziel was the Soul Reaver. The Soul Reaver was Raziel. The blade existed before he was bound into it. He wielded it before he became it. The cause was also the effect, and the effect was also the cause. And this impossible loop became the key to everything. The one element that might allow Nosgoth's fate to be changed. The one being who could potentially break the cycle of decay and death that had been locked in place since the pillars were corrupted. Because if Raziel was already an impossibility, already a violation of fate, then perhaps he could commit the greatest violation of all. Perhaps he could change what was meant to be unchangeable. Perhaps he could save a world that had been doomed from the moment Kain refused to die. Or perhaps he would simply fulfill the destiny that had been written for him all along, despite believing he was acting freely. The paradox did not provide answers. It only provided possibilities. And possibilities, in a world as determined and fate-driven as Nosgoth, were the rarest and most precious thing of all. Act 8. Time, Fate, and Free Will. We have spoken of the pillars, of corruption, of vampires and empires and decay, of Raziel's fall and impossible resurrection, of a weapon that exists in defiance of causality itself. But beneath all of this, beneath every event and choice and tragedy, there is a deeper conflict. One that has nothing to do with good or evil, nothing to do with right or wrong. It is about control, about who shapes Nosgoth's destiny, about what forces determine how history unfolds, about whether anyone, anywhere, has ever truly been free. And at the center of this conflict is an entity that has been manipulating events since before human civilization, since before the pillars themselves, perhaps. The Elder God. The Elder God and the Wheel of Fate, the great puppeteer. The Elder God is not a god in any traditional sense. It does not create. It does not love. It does not seek worship or devotion for their own sake. It is, at its most fundamental level, a parasite. It exists as a massive, ancient entity dwelling in the depths of Nosgoth, a creature of tentacles and vast, incomprehensible form. It is old beyond measure. It predates the recorded history of vampires and humans. It may predate the pillars themselves, though this is uncertain. What is certain is its purpose, its function, the system it has established to sustain its own existence. The Wheel of Fate. The Elder God claims to be the hub of the wheel, the center around which the cycle of life, death, and rebirth turns. According to its own narrative, it maintains the natural order. Souls are born. They live. They die. They pass through the wheel, where the Elder God processes them, and they are reborn to begin the cycle again. This is the story the Elder God tells. The narrative it uses to justify its existence, its authority, its right to shape how souls move through Nosgoth. But the truth is simpler and more terrible. The Elder God feeds on souls. Every soul that passes through the wheel is consumed, not in the sense of being destroyed, but in the sense of being drained. The spiritual energy that comprises a soul's essence is siphoned off by the Elder God, sustaining its vast existence, feeding its immortal hunger. The wheel is not a natural cycle. It is a feeding system, a mechanism designed to ensure that souls continuously flow to the Elder God, providing it with an endless supply of spiritual sustenance. And for this system to work, all souls must enter the wheel. All beings must die, must be recycled, must feed the entity at the center, which is where vampires become a problem. Why vampires threaten the wheel? Immortality as rebellion. Vampires do not die naturally. They are immortal, and their immortality means they do not enter the wheel of fate. They are souls that have been removed from the cycle, taken out of circulation, no longer available to be consumed and reborn. They persist indefinitely, their spiritual energy contained within their own existence rather than flowing through the wheel to feed the Elder God. From the Elder God's perspective, vampires are not monsters. They are not evil. They are simply inefficient, a disruption to the feeding system. Souls that should be cycling through the wheel but are instead locked away in immortal bodies, unavailable, lost. One vampire is a minor problem, a single soul removed from the cycle. Unfortunate but manageable. But a civilization of vampires, an empire of immortals, thousands or potentially millions of souls removed from the wheel indefinitely. That is a crisis, a threat to the Elder God's entire existence. Because if too many souls are removed from the cycle, if immortality becomes widespread, the wheel slows. The flow of spiritual energy decreases, and the Elder God starves. This is why the Elder God opposes vampires. Not because they are morally wrong, not because they violate some divine law, but because they threaten its food supply. The ancient vampires were acceptable, perhaps, because they were meant to be stewards. They had a purpose within the larger system. But when they were cursed, when they began to multiply potentially, when they became something that could spread and persist, they became a threat. And the Elder God has been working to eliminate that threat ever since. Not directly. The Elder God does not fight its own battles. It is too vast, too alien, too removed from the physical world to act directly in most cases. Instead, it uses agents, manipulates others into doing its work, shapes narratives and destinies to ensure that events unfold in ways that serve its purposes. It does not need to lie, exactly. It simply presents itself as the natural order, as the wheel, as the force that maintains balance and ensures the continuation of existence. And most beings, encountering it, accept this narrative, accept that they are serving something greater, accept that the cycle is natural and must be maintained. They do not realize they are serving a parasite, that the natural order is simply a feeding mechanism, that they are being used to ensure the Elder God's continued sustenance. This is manipulation at its most fundamental level, not through force, not through obvious villainy, but through narrative, through the shaping of how beings understand their place in the world. Mobius enforcing destiny, the instrument of control, and the Elder God's most effective agent, its most loyal and capable servant, is Mobius. Mobius is the guardian of time, and he uses his position, his powers, his access to temporal knowledge, to ensure that events unfold according to the Elder God's design. He does not control time directly. He cannot reach into the past and change events. But he can see through time, can observe possible futures, can understand the consequences of actions before they are taken. And he uses this knowledge to manipulate others, to push events in specific directions, to ensure that the timeline develops in ways that serve the Elder God's purposes. The vampire purges? Mobius orchestrated them, not by leading Seraphan armies, but by providing the narrative, the justification, the sense of divine purpose that turned humans into an extermination force. Kain's murder and resurrection? Mobius was involved, working through the dark entity, ensuring that Kain would be transformed into a vampire at the exact moment he became the Balance Guardian, thereby ensuring the pillars would remain corrupted. Raziel's execution and resurrection? The Elder God used Raziel's suffering as an opportunity to gain an agent, but Mobius was there too, in the background, ensuring that Raziel would interpret his new existence in ways that served the larger agenda. Every major event in Nosgoth's history has Mobius's fingerprints on it. Every tragedy, every corruption, every moment where history could have gone differently but somehow always ends up serving the Elder God's purposes. Mobius is not just manipulating individuals. He is enforcing destiny itself, making sure that fate unfolds according to the plan. That free will, such as it exists, always leads people toward the outcomes the Elder God desires. He presents himself as a reformer, as someone working to fix the corruption in the circle, as an ally to whoever he is speaking to, and he is convincing enough that most people never realize they are being used. Kain trusted him for a time. Raziel encountered him across multiple timelines and never fully understood the depth of his deception. The Seraphan believed they were serving divine purpose while actually serving the Elder God through Mobius's manipulation. This is how control works in Nosgoth. Not through obvious tyranny, not through force, but through the careful shaping of narratives, the manipulation of choices, the creation of situations where people believe they are acting freely but are actually walking paths that have been laid out for them. Mobius is the instrument of this control. The Time Guardian who uses his temporal knowledge not to serve the pillars, but to ensure that destiny unfolds according to the Elder God's design. And for centuries, this worked. History proceeded along the intended path. The vampires were nearly destroyed. Kain was trapped in a position where his existence perpetuated corruption. Raziel was resurrected as an agent to destroy what remained of vampire civilization. Everything was going according to plan, except for one thing. Raziel's partial freedom from fate, the unbound variable. Raziel was meant to be an agent, a weapon. The Elder God resurrected him to serve a specific purpose: destroy vampires, return their souls to the wheel, restore the cycle that they had disrupted. And Raziel did serve this purpose. For a time, he hunted his brothers, consumed their souls, tore through the vampire empire with single-minded determination. But something was different about him. Something the Elder God had not anticipated, or perhaps could not fully control. Raziel was a paradox. His very existence violated causality. And that violation gave him something that almost nothing else in Nosgoth possessed. Freedom from fate. Not complete freedom. Not absolute immunity to destiny. But partial freedom. A degree of autonomy that allowed him to make choices that were not predetermined, that were not locked into the timeline, that could actually alter how events unfolded. The Elder God could not see Raziel's future clearly, could not predict with certainty what he would do, could not control him the way it controlled others. This was because Raziel existed outside the normal flow of time. His paradoxical nature, his connection to the Soul Reaver, his status as a being who both was and would become the weapon meant to destroy him, all of this placed him slightly apart from the deterministic structure that governed everything else. He could be influenced, could be manipulated, could be pointed in specific directions. But he could not be controlled absolutely. And this terrified the Elder God, though it would never admit this fear. Because if Raziel could act freely, if his choices were not predetermined, then he could potentially do something that was not part of the plan. Could make a choice that disrupted the carefully orchestrated timeline. Could become not an agent of the Elder God's will but an opponent of it. Raziel did not realize this at first. did not understand that his partial freedom from fate was the most dangerous thing about him from the Elder God's perspective. He simply knew that he felt different, that his choices seemed to matter in a way that other beings' choices did not. That when he made a decision, history actually shifted, rather than simply proceeding along a predetermined path. He was still being manipulated, still being used. The Elder God and Mobius were still shaping his understanding of events, still providing him with narratives that served their purposes. But he had the capacity to reject those narratives, to see through the manipulation, to choose differently. And that capacity, that small degree of freedom, would eventually become central to everything. Kain, sensing history has been tampered with. The second perspective. Kain had lived for over 1,000 years, had ruled an empire for centuries, had witnessed the slow decay of Nosgoth firsthand, had watched as the corruption he perpetuated by his continued existence spread through the world. And he had grown in understanding, had begun to see patterns that others could not see, had started to suspect that events were not unfolding naturally, but were being guided by some intelligence, some will that operated behind the scenes. He sensed that history had been tampered with, that the timeline was not organic but designed, that the choices he had made, his murder, his resurrection, his refusal to die, were not as free as he had believed. Kain was brilliant, patient, capable of thinking across centuries rather than years, and he began to piece together the truth. Someone had orchestrated his murder. Someone had ensured he would be resurrected as a vampire at the exact moment he became the Balance Guardian. Someone had manipulated events to ensure the pillars would remain corrupted, Nosgoth would continue to decay, and vampires would be hunted to near extinction. He did not yet know all the players, did not fully understand the Elder God's role or the depth of Mobius's betrayal. But he knew something was wrong, knew that the history he had lived through had been shaped by an outside intelligence. And he began to plan, not reactively, not emotionally, but with the cold calculation of someone who understood that he was playing a game against an opponent he could not yet fully see. Kain started to manipulate time himself. Not directly, he was not the Time Guardian, did not have Mobius's powers, but he could make choices that echoed across centuries, could set events in motion that would not pay off for generations but would eventually create opportunities to change things. He realized that if history had been tampered with, it could be tampered with again, that the timeline was not as fixed as it appeared, that with sufficient understanding, sufficient patience, sufficient willingness to make terrible choices, it might be possible to alter fate itself. And when Raziel emerged from the abyss, when this impossible wraith appeared hunting vampires with a blade that was somehow connected to the soul Reaver Kain had wielded, Kain began to understand that Raziel was the key. Not because Raziel was more powerful, but because Raziel was free, or partially free, from the deterministic structure that bound everything else. Kain could not change fate directly. He was too embedded in the timeline, too locked into the structure of events. But Raziel might be able to. Raziel, the paradox, the living violation of causality, might have the capacity to make choices that actually mattered. And so Kain began to manipulate Raziel. Not as Mobius did, through lies and false narratives, but through truth, through revealing information at specific moments, through creating situations where Raziel would be forced to make choices that might alter the timeline. Kain was playing the same game as the Elder God and Mobius, but he was playing it toward a different end. Not to maintain the wheel, not to enforce destiny, but to break free of it, to find a way to change what had always been meant to be unchangeable. Control, the true conflict. This is not a story about good and evil. It is not a tale of heroes and villains, though it has been framed that way by various participants. It is a story about control, about who gets to shape destiny, about whether fate is real or constructed, about whether any being, anywhere in Nosgoth, has ever truly been free. The Elder God wants control, wants to maintain the wheel, ensure souls continue to flow, perpetuate the system that feeds its existence. It uses manipulation, uses agents like Mobius, uses narratives about natural order and divine purpose to ensure beings serve its interests without realizing they are being used. Mobius wants control. Or perhaps he simply enjoys being the instrument of control, the one who shapes events across centuries, who ensures history unfolds according to design. He is the enforcer of destiny, the guarantee that fate will not be defied. Kain wants control, but his desire is different. He does not want to shape others. He wants freedom. Freedom from the destiny that was imposed on him. Freedom from the manipulation he has been subject to since his murder. Freedom to exist without perpetuating the world's decay. And Raziel. Raziel is caught between all of them. Used by the Elder God. Manipulated by Mobius. Shaped by Kain. But possessing something none of them fully control, the capacity to make choices that are not predetermined. He is the variable, the element that might break the cycle, the paradox that might allow fate itself to be changed. Every being in Nosgoth is fighting for control. Not control of territory or resources, but control of destiny itself. Control of what history means. Control of whether the future can be different from what has been written. And at the center of this conflict is a simple question that has no simple answer. Is anyone truly free? Or are we all puppets, dancing on strings we cannot see, believing we are choosing while actually following a script that was written long before we existed? Raziel's partial freedom from fate suggests that true choice might be possible. That destiny is not absolute. That the timeline can be altered. But it also suggests something more disturbing, that most beings are not free. That their choices are predetermined. That they are acting out roles in a play they did not write and cannot escape from. This is the deeper horror of Nosgoth. Not the decay, not the corruption, not the violence or suffering, but the possibility that none of it matters. That every choice has already been made. That fate is real, and free will is an illusion, and the only beings who can potentially break free are those who exist as paradoxes, as violations of the very laws that govern existence. Raziel is a paradox, and that makes him dangerous, not because he is powerful, but because he might be free. And freedom, in a deterministic universe, is the most dangerous thing of all. Act 9. Soul Reaver 2 and Defying History. For centuries, perhaps millennia, fate had been enforced. The timeline had proceeded along its intended path. The Elder God fed. Mobius manipulated. Kain ruled over decay. And Raziel hunted vampires, believing he was serving justice when he was actually serving a parasite's hunger. But fate, for all its apparent solidity, has always had one weakness in Nosgoth. Raziel, the paradox, the being who existed partially outside the deterministic structure, the one element that could not be perfectly controlled. And when Raziel was given the means to travel through time, when he gained access to the mechanisms that could move him backward and forward through history, the carefully constructed timeline began to crack. Not obviously, not all at once, but slowly, inexorably, as Raziel made choices that were not part of the plan. History began to bend. The chronoplast, gateway through time. The device was called the chronoplast, a massive machine, ancient and powerful, capable of moving beings through time itself. It had been built, or perhaps discovered, by those who understood temporal mechanics far better than most beings ever would. Mobius had won. Of course he did. As the Time Guardian, as the one who could see through history and shape events across centuries, he would naturally have access to the tools that allowed physical travel through the timeline. But Mobius was not the only one with a chronoplast. The devices existed in multiple locations, in multiple time periods. They were gateways, nodes in a network that connected different moments in history. When Raziel encountered a chronoplast, when he activated it and stepped through, he was given something that almost no being in Nosgoth's history had possessed: the ability to move freely through time, to travel backward into the past, to witness events firsthand, to potentially alter them. This was extraordinarily dangerous, not just for the obvious reasons that changing the past could destroy the future, could create paradoxes, could unravel causality entirely, but because it gave Raziel access to information he was never meant to have. Knowledge of how events had truly unfolded. Understanding of who had manipulated what. Awareness of the larger patterns that governed Nosgoth's history. The Elder God did not want Raziel traveling through time. It was too risky, too unpredictable, but it could not prevent him. could not stop him from using the chronoplast once he had found it. Because Raziel was a paradox. And paradoxes can move through time in ways that normal beings cannot. They do not immediately create contradictions. They do not cause history to snap back or correct itself. They exist in a state of superposition, occupying multiple temporal locations simultaneously without destroying the timeline. So Raziel traveled backward, primarily, into Nosgoth's past, seeking answers, seeking understanding, seeking the truth about what had been done to him, and why, and by whom. And in traveling through time, he began to see the strings, the manipulation, the careful orchestration that had shaped his entire existence. And he began to pull at those strings, to make choices that defied what was meant to happen, to alter history in ways that were not part of the Elder God's design. Raziel, traveling into the past, witness to manipulation. When Raziel first traveled backward through time, he did not immediately understand the full scope of what he was seeing. He simply moved through history, observing events from his own past, from periods before his resurrection, from times when he had been alive, or had not yet existed at all. He witnessed the vampire purges, saw the Seraphan in their prime, holy warriors hunting vampires with absolute conviction. He did not yet know that he had been one of them in his human life. That knowledge would come later, a revelation that would shatter what little remained of his sense of identity. He encountered Mobius across multiple time periods, saw the Time Guardian manipulating events, providing information to the Seraphan, shaping narratives, ensuring that history unfolded according to design. And he began to understand that Mobius was not an ally, had never been an ally, was, in fact, one of the primary architects of the manipulation that had defined Nosgoth's history for centuries. He met Janos Audron, the last ancient vampire, still alive in the past, still maintaining his lonely vigil in the Eyrie. Janos provided context, explained the history of vampires as guardians, revealed the truth about the Hyaldan curse, gave Raziel pieces of knowledge that the Elder God had never wanted him to have. And slowly, traveling through time, witnessing events firsthand, Raziel began to assemble the truth, began to see the larger pattern, began to understand that he had been used, manipulated, pointed at targets that served the Elder God's purposes while being told he was serving justice. The Elder God was not maintaining natural order. It was maintaining a feeding system. The wheel was not divine. It was parasitic. And every agent who served it, including Raziel himself, was simply ensuring that souls continued to flow to an entity that existed only to consume them. This knowledge was devastating, but it was also liberating, because understanding the manipulation meant Raziel could potentially resist it, could make choices based on truth rather than the narratives he had been fed. He was traveling through time, witnessing history, learning things he was never meant to know, and the timeline, carefully maintained for centuries by Mobius and the Elder God, began to destabilize. Killing his own human self, the loop closes. In traveling through the past, Raziel eventually encountered something he had not anticipated. Something that made the paradox of his existence even more complex, even more impossible. He encountered himself, his human self, Raziel the Seraphan priest, the one who had hunted vampires with zealous conviction, the one who had participated in the purges, the one who had believed absolutely in the righteousness of destroying Kain's kind, the one who had eventually died and been raised as a vampire by Kain, though with no memory of his human life. Raziel the Wraith stood before Raziel the human, two versions of the same being, separated by death and resurrection and centuries of time. One knew everything, one knew nothing, and they fought, because Raziel the Seraphan saw only a monster, a wraith, a creature that needed to be destroyed. He did not recognize himself, did not understand that he was facing his own future. He simply attacked, with all the skill and conviction that had made him one of the Seraphan's elite. And Raziel the Wraith killed him, killed his own human self, ended the life that he had once lived, completing a loop that had always existed but which he had not understood until this moment. His human death had been at his own hands. Not metaphorically, literally. He had killed himself. had ensured that he would die so that Kain could eventually raise him as a vampire, which would eventually lead to his execution in the abyss, which would eventually lead to his resurrection as a wraith, which would eventually lead to him traveling back in time to kill his human self. The loop was closed. The paradox was complete. Cause and effect had become indistinguishable. He was the reason for his own death, which was the reason for his resurrection, which was the reason he could kill himself in the first place. This should have destroyed the timeline, should have created a contradiction so fundamental that reality could not accommodate it. But it did not, because Raziel was already a paradox. Adding another layer of impossibility to his existence did not break anything. It simply made the paradox more complex, more deeply woven into the fabric of time. And it freed him, in a sense. Because if he was responsible for his own death, if the loop was self-contained, then he was not simply a victim of external manipulation. He was also an agent, a participant in his own fate, however impossible that participation might be. He had killed himself, and in doing so, he had ensured that everything that followed, his vampiric existence, his execution, his resurrection as a wraith, would happen. He was not just caught in a loop. He was the loop, founding Kain's empire retroactively, becoming the architect. But Raziel's interference in the past went beyond his own death. As he traveled through time, as he learned more about history, as he made choices that were not part of the Elder God's design, he began to alter events in ways that rippled forward through the centuries. He encountered Kain in the past. Not the Kain who had executed him, not the ancient emperor who ruled from the broken pillars, but a younger Kain. A Kain who was still building his empire, still learning what it meant to be a vampire, still making the choices that would eventually lead to the world Raziel had known. And Raziel, knowingly or not, influenced those choices, provided information, created situations, made interventions that shaped how Kain would proceed. In a very real sense, Raziel retroactively founded Kain's empire, not as a deliberate act, not with full awareness of what he was doing, but through his presence in the past, through his interactions with Kain, through the information he revealed and the choices he made, Raziel became one of the architects of the very empire he had later served as a lieutenant. He helped create the world that would eventually destroy him. He laid foundations for the empire that would rule for a millennium. He influenced Kain's decisions in ways that would echo forward through centuries. The paradox expanded. It was no longer just that Raziel was the sole Reaver, or that he had killed his human self. It was that his entire existence was self-referential, self-creating, a loop that had no clear beginning or end because it was responsible for its own formation. He was not just a product of history. He was one of history's architects. He had shaped the past that had shaped him. And this meant that the timeline was not as fixed as it had appeared. Events that seemed predetermined were actually the result of future interference. Causality was not linear but circular, with effects reaching backward to become their own causes. History was not a straight line. It was a web, and Raziel was one of the threads that held it together, even as he pulled at it, trying to understand it, trying to change it. Sparing Kain in Soul Reaver 2, the crack in fate. The climax of Soul Reaver 2, the moment where fate truly cracked, came when Raziel had the opportunity to kill Kain. He had pursued Kain through time, had confronted him again and again, had grown in power and understanding, and finally, he had Kain vulnerable, defeated, ready to be destroyed. The Elder God demanded he kill him, insisted that this was the moment, that Kain's death was necessary, that it would restore balance, would allow the timeline to proceed as it was meant to. This was what Raziel had been pursuing since his resurrection. Revenge against the one who had executed him. Justice against the one who had cast him into the abyss. The destruction of the vampire emperor who had ruled over Nosgoth's decay for over a millennium. All he had to do was strike. End Kain's existence. Complete the mission the Elder God had given him. And Raziel refused. Not because he forgave Kain. Not because he had suddenly developed compassion for the one who had destroyed him. But because he understood. He understood that killing Kain was what the Elder God wanted. That it was part of the plan. That it would serve the very manipulation he had been trying to escape from. He understood that his entire resurrection, his entire existence as a wraith, had been designed to make him into a weapon pointed at Kain. That the Elder God had used his rage, his sense of betrayal, his desire for revenge, to ensure he would become the instrument of Kain's destruction. And he understood that if he killed Kain now, he would simply be fulfilling his role as a pawn, would be acting exactly as the Elder God had intended, would be serving the same master he had been trying to break free from. So he chose differently. He spared Kain, defied the Elder God's command, made a choice that was not part of the predetermined timeline. And in that moment, fate cracked. Not dramatically, not with cosmic fanfare or reality-shattering, but quietly. A single choice that should not have been possible. A deviation from the script that had been written millennia ago. Raziel had done something the Elder God had not anticipated. Had exercised his partial freedom from fate in a way that created a genuine divergence. A moment where history split, where the timeline branched, where what was meant to happen did not happen. The Elder God was furious, desperate. It had manipulated events for centuries to reach this exact moment. Had orchestrated Raziel's entire existence to ensure Kain would be destroyed at precisely this time, in precisely this way. And Raziel had simply refused. It was not a grand gesture, not a heroic act. It was simply a choice. A single decision to not do what he was expected to do. To act based on understanding rather than manipulation. But that single choice changed everything. The moment fate cracked, the soft climax. This is the soft climax of the entire saga. Not a battle. Not a dramatic confrontation. Not the destruction of some great evil. Just a choice. A refusal. A moment where someone who was meant to be controlled demonstrated that they could not be controlled absolutely. Raziel spared Kain. And in doing so, he created a branch point. A moment where the future became uncertain. Where the carefully orchestrated timeline that Mobius and the Elder God had maintained for centuries suddenly became unstable. Everything that came after this moment would be different. Not because Kain lived. Kain living was significant, yes, but it was not the primary point. But because Raziel had demonstrated that fate could be defied. That the deterministic structure governing Nosgoth was not absolute. That free will, however partial, however limited, was real. The Elder God could no longer perfectly predict what would happen, could no longer ensure that events would unfold according to its design. Because Raziel, the variable, the paradox, had proven that he could make choices that were genuinely free. And if one being could defy fate, perhaps others could too. Perhaps the entire structure of predetermination that governed Nosgoth could be broken. Perhaps history itself could be rewritten. This was what the Elder God feared most. Not death, not opposition, but the loss of control. The possibility that beings might act freely rather than according to the script. That the wheel might stop turning. That the feeding system might collapse. Raziel had cracked fate, not destroyed it. Not escaped it entirely, but cracked it, created a fracture, introduced genuine uncertainty into a timeline that had been perfectly controlled for millennia. And through that crack, possibility emerged. The possibility of change. The possibility of a different future. The possibility that Nosgoth's fate was not sealed, that the decay could be stopped, that the cycle could be broken. It was not a guarantee. It was simply a possibility, a chance. A single moment where someone had chosen differently and reality had accommodated that choice rather than immediately correcting it. History had bent, and now it remained to be seen whether it would snap back into place or whether the bend could be maintained, whether the crack could be widened, whether fate itself could be permanently altered. Raziel had spared Kain, and in that act of mercy, or perhaps simply that act of defiance, he had given Nosgoth something it had not had for centuries. Hope. However fragile, however uncertain, the hope that perhaps, just perhaps, things could be different. That the story did not have to end the way it had always been meant to end. That someone, somewhere, had the capacity to change fate itself. Act X. Defiance and the end of the wheel. The crack in fate had been made. Raziel had spared Kain. The timeline had branched, diverged from what had been intended. And now the question was not whether fate could be defied, But what would be done with that defiance? What would come next, in a world where the script had been broken? The answer, as it turned out, involved forces even older than the Elder God's manipulation. Conflicts that predated the corruption of the Pillars. Enemies who had been waiting for centuries, locked behind barriers that were finally beginning to fail. The Hyaldan had not been idle in their exile, and they were about to make their presence known in ways that would force both Kain and Raziel to make choices neither of them had anticipated. Final choices. Definitive ones. Choices that would determine not just their own fates, but the fate of Nosgoth itself. Champions of vampires and Hyaldan, ancient war renewed. The conflict between vampires and Hyaldan had never truly ended. It had simply been postponed. The Hyaldan had been banished to the demon realm, sealed away by the Pillars, unable to return to Nosgoth. But the Pillars had been corrupted for over a millennium, and corruption weakens barriers. Slowly, the seal had been deteriorating. The prison that held the Hyaldan was failing, had been failing for centuries, and now it was failing catastrophically. The Hyaldan could not return physically, not yet. The barrier was weakened but not broken. But they could reach through, could influence events, could possess beings in the material realm, could work toward their own agenda even while still technically imprisoned. And they had champions, beings who served their cause, who worked to complete the destruction of the seal, who sought to bring the Hyaldan back into Nosgoth so that the ancient war could resume. The vampires, meanwhile, had Kain. And increasingly, they had Raziel, though Raziel's allegiance was complex, uncertain, no longer clearly aligned with any faction. This was not a simple conflict of good versus evil. The Hyaldan were not monsters. They were a race that had been unjustly exiled, from their perspective, imprisoned for refusing to submit to the wheel of fate. They had legitimate grievances, legitimate reasons to want their freedom. But their return would also mean the complete collapse of the Pillars. The destruction of the barrier would not just free the Hyaldan. It would cause Nosgoth itself to begin unraveling. The world had been built on these foundations, and removing them entirely would have consequences far beyond simply allowing another race to return. The vampires, meanwhile, were trying to preserve something that was already doomed. The Pillars were corrupted. Kain's continued existence ensured they would remain corrupted. The system could not be saved in its current form. But destroying it entirely meant risking everything. Meant potentially causing Nosgoth to collapse into chaos, to be consumed by the forces that had been held back for millennia. There were no good options. Only choices between different forms of disaster. And both Kain and Raziel understood this. Understood that they were not fighting for salvation. They were fighting to determine what form Nosgoth's ending would take. Champions on both sides. Ancient conflicts renewed. And in the middle, two beings who had been manipulated, used, destroyed, and resurrected, trying to find some path forward that did not simply serve another master's agenda. Raziel choosing self-sacrifice, the final act of will. Throughout his existence, as human, as vampire, as wraith, Raziel had been used. Had been pointed at targets. Had been told his purpose was something greater than himself while actually serving agendas he did not understand. The Seraphan had used him to destroy vampires. Kain had used him as a lieutenant. The Elder God had used him as a weapon. Even his partial freedom from fate had been exploited, leveraged by various forces trying to shape history according to their designs. But now, finally, Raziel understood. Understood the full scope of the manipulation. Understood what he was. What he had been meant to become. What role he had played and was meant to continue playing in the cosmic machinery that governed Nosgoth. He understood that he was meant to become the Soul Reaver. That his soul would be bound into the blade. That he would become the weapon that devoured souls, the instrument that had terrorized Nosgoth for centuries. This was his destiny. This was what all the manipulation had been driving toward. Not his death. Not his destruction. But his transformation into a tool. A weapon that could be wielded by whoever possessed it. And Raziel, understanding this, made a choice that no one had anticipated. He chose to fulfill his destiny, but on his own terms. He would enter the blade, would allow his soul to be bound into the Soul Reaver, would become the weapon he was always meant to become, but not as a victim, not as someone who had been forced into this fate against his will. As a willing participant, as someone making a conscious choice to sacrifice himself for a specific purpose. This was not submission. This was defiance. Defiance of the manipulation that had tried to force him into this role. Defiance of the Elder God's plans. Defiance of fate itself, even as he fulfilled what fate had demanded. Because if he entered the blade willingly, if he made this choice consciously and deliberately, then he retained agency, retained will, retained some measure of control over what he would become. He would be the Soul Reaver, but he would be a Soul Reaver with purpose, with intent, with the capacity to act according to his own understanding, rather than simply as a tool in someone else's hand. This was the only form of freedom available to him. Not escape, not survival, but the freedom to choose his own sacrifice, to determine the terms of his transformation, to ensure that even in becoming a weapon, he remained himself, entering the Reaver willingly, becoming the blade. The moment itself was quiet. No grand drama, no cosmic fanfare, simply a choice, made with full awareness of its consequences. Raziel approached the blade, the physical Soul Reaver that Kain carried, the weapon that was, in a sense, already him, had always been him, would always be him, and he stepped into it, allowed his soul to merge with the weapon, permitted the binding that had been inevitable since his resurrection, since his creation, since the first moment the paradox of his existence had come into being. His spectral form dissolved, his consciousness compressed, his entire being reduced to essence and bound within the blade. It was not painful, exactly. Or perhaps it was, but pain had become so familiar to Raziel by this point that it barely registered. He had been unmade in the lake of the dead, had existed as a wraith for centuries, had experienced dissolution and reformation countless times. This was simply another transformation, another change in state, from wraith to weapon, from being to tool, except that he retained awareness, retained will. Because he had entered willingly, he was not simply trapped. He was bound, yes, but not as a prisoner, as an inhabitant, as the soul that gave the blade its power and also its purpose. The Soul Reaver was complete now, the paradox resolved, in a sense, by Raziel choosing to become what he had always been meant to be, the weapon that was also a person, the tool that retained agency, the blade that could think, feel, choose. Kain wielded it now, but it was not simply Kain's weapon anymore. It was Raziel, and Raziel, even bound within the blade, retained the capacity to act, to influence, to guide. He had sacrificed his independent existence, had given up the possibility of ever being separate from the weapon again, had bound himself permanently to this form. But in doing so, he had ensured that the Soul Reaver would be more than just a soul-devouring blade. It would be a weapon with purpose, with understanding, with the capacity to act in ways that served something other than simple destruction. He had become the blade, and in becoming it, he had made it his. Cleansing Kain, purification through sacrifice. When Kain wielded the completed Soul Reaver, when he held the blade that now contained Raziel's willing sacrifice, something happened that had not been possible before. Kain could be purified. Kain was corrupted, had been corrupted since the moment he became the balance guardian while simultaneously being a vampire. His very existence was the reason the pillar of balance remained poisoned. His soul carried the taint that prevented the pillars from healing. This corruption was not something that could be removed through ordinary means. It was fundamental to his nature. As long as he existed as he was, as long as he remained the vampire balance guardian, the corruption would persist. But the Soul Reaver, now containing Raziel's willing sacrifice, had properties it had not possessed before. It could purify, could cleanse, could remove corruption from even the most fundamental level. When the blade pierced Kain, when Raziel within the weapon touched Kain's soul directly, the corruption burned away. Not destroying Kain, not ending his existence, but transforming him, purifying him, removing the taint that had defined him for over a millennium. Kain was cleansed. The corruption that had perpetuated Nosgoth's decay was removed from him. He remained a vampire, remained immortal, remained himself. But the specific corruption that had kept the pillar of balance poisoned was gone. This was Raziel's gift, his sacrifice made manifest. By choosing to enter the blade willingly, by retaining his agency and purpose even in weapon form, he had become capable of doing something that nothing else in Nosgoth could do. He had saved Kain, not from death, but from the corruption that had trapped him in an impossible position for centuries, had given him the possibility of existing without perpetuating the world's decay. It was not forgiveness. Raziel had not forgiven Kain for casting him into the abyss. But it was something more complex. Recognition, perhaps. Understanding. The acknowledgement that Kain had also been a victim of manipulation, had also been trapped in an impossible situation, had also been used as a pawn in games he had not fully understood. Raziel cleansed Kain, and in doing so, he gave Nosgoth something it had not had since Ariel's murder. A chance. However small, however uncertain. Wounding the Elder God, striking the parasite. But cleansing Kain was not the end. There was still the Elder God. The parasite that had manipulated events for millennia. The entity that had orchestrated so much suffering, so much death, simply to maintain its feeding system. The Elder God could not be killed, not easily. It was too vast, too ancient, too fundamental to Nosgotha's structure. It had existed for longer than the pillars, longer than vampires or humans, perhaps longer than Nosgoth itself. But it could be wounded, could be weakened, could be made to understand that it was not invulnerable, not beyond opposition. When Raziel sacrificed himself, when he entered the blade willingly and used that blade to cleanse Kain, he also struck at the Elder God. Not physically. The Elder God did not exist fully in the physical realm, but spiritually, conceptually. He defied it, refused its control, demonstrated that beings could act freely, could make choices that were not part of the wheel, could exist in opposition to its will. And in that defiance, he wounded it. Not fatally, but significantly. He showed that the Elder God's power was not absolute, that its manipulation could be resisted, that the wheel could be defied. The Soul Reaver, containing Raziel's willing sacrifice, became a weapon capable of harming even this ancient entity. When it struck, it carried not just physical force but spiritual intent. The intent to break free, to resist, to demonstrate that the parasitic system could be opposed. The Elder God retreated, not destroyed, not killed, but wounded, forced to recognize that its control was not complete, that there were beings in Nosgoth who would no longer serve it, who would actively oppose it, who had the capacity to do so effectively. This was not victory, not in any complete sense. The Elder God still existed. The wheel still turned. The fundamental structure of Nosgoth had not been completely overturned. But it was wounded, and a wounded parasite is a weakened one that can no longer act with perfect confidence, one that must now account for opposition it had not anticipated. Raziel had struck at the Elder God, and the wound would not heal quickly, breaking the wheel's visible power. The structure cracks. With Kain purified and the Elder God wounded, something else became possible. Something that had seemed impossible for millennia. The wheel of fate could be broken. Not destroyed entirely. The metaphysical structure was too fundamental for that. But its visible power could be shattered. Its ability to enforce destiny absolutely could be compromised. The wheel had always been presented as inevitable, as the natural order, as the cycle that all souls must follow. Life, death, rebirth. No escape. No alternatives. Submit to the wheel or be obliterated by it. But Raziel had demonstrated that this was not true. That beings could exist outside the wheel. That immortality was not a crime but a choice. That the natural order was actually a constructed system designed to serve the Elder God's hunger. And with this understanding spreading, with the Elder God wounded and unable to enforce its will as completely as before, the wheel's power fractured. It did not stop turning entirely. Souls still died, still passed through whatever judgment or processing occurred, still continued in some form. But it was no longer absolute, no longer inescapable. There were cracks in the system now. Spaces where beings could exist without feeding the parasite. Ways to persist beyond death that did not require submitting to the wheel's demands. The visible power of the wheel, its ability to enforce destiny, to ensure all beings eventually served the Elder God's purposes, was broken. Not destroyed, but compromised. Weakened to the point where it could no longer control everything, could no longer guarantee that history would unfold according to its design. This was what Raziel's sacrifice had accomplished. Not salvation, not restoration, not a return to some golden age, but freedom, however limited, however partial. The freedom to choose, the freedom to resist, the freedom to exist without serving the parasite that had controlled Nosgoth for so long. Nosgoth's future left uncertain, no resolution. And so we come to the end. Or perhaps not the end, but simply the place where the story stops being told. Where events have unfolded to a point, and what comes next remains unknown. Nosgoth's future is uncertain. Genuinely uncertain, in a way it had not been for millennia. Kain is purified. The corruption that kept the pillar of balance poisoned is removed from him. But the pillar itself is still damaged. The circle is still broken. The other guardians are still corrupted or dead. The pillars themselves remain cracked, failing, slowly crumbling. Raziel is gone, transformed into the sole Reaver. His sacrifice was willing, purposeful, meaningful, but it was still a sacrifice. He no longer exists as an independent being. He is the blade now, a weapon, a tool, however much agency he retained in becoming one. The Elder God is wounded but not destroyed. It still exists, still hungers, still seeks to maintain the wheel, to ensure souls continue to flow to it. But it is weakened. Its control is compromised. Its manipulation can now be resisted. The Hyaldan remain imprisoned, but the barrier continues to weaken. Their return seems inevitable, though when and how remains unclear. The ancient conflict between vampires and Hyaldan is not resolved. It is simply postponed, waiting for the pillars to fail completely. The wheel is broken, but not destroyed. Souls still pass through it. The cycle still turns. But it is no longer absolute, no longer inescapable. There are cracks where beings can exist freely, can choose their own paths, can defy the destiny that had been written for them. Nothing is resolved. Everything remains in flux. The decay continues, though perhaps slower now. The pillars still crumble, though perhaps they can be repaired. The Elder God still manipulates, though perhaps it can be opposed. Nosgoth's fate is not sealed. For the first time in over a millennium, the future is genuinely open. Not predetermined. Not locked into an inevitable trajectory. But what that future will be remains unknown. Cycles broken, but not resolved, the contemplative end. This is not a happy ending. It is not a triumphant one. There are no celebrations. No restoration of a golden age. No return to how things were before everything fell apart. But it is also not a tragedy. Not a defeat. Not the inevitable doom that had seemed certain for so long. It is simply open, uncertain, a future that has not yet been written. Cycles have been broken. The deterministic structure that governed Nosgoth for centuries has been compromised. Fate can be defied. Destiny can be altered. Choices matter now in ways they had not mattered before. But the breaking of cycles does not automatically create resolution. It simply creates possibility. The possibility that things could be different. That Nosgoth might be saved, or it might fall in a different way, or it might persist in some new form that no one has anticipated. Kain remains, purified but not saved, freed from corruption but not from responsibility. He will continue to rule, to plan, to work toward outcomes he believes are necessary. Whether those outcomes serve Nosgoth or simply serve his own vision of what Nosgoth should be remains unclear. Raziel is gone, but also present. Transformed into a weapon but retaining agency within that transformation. His will persists, guiding the blade, influencing events even in his new form. His sacrifice was meaningful, but what it ultimately accomplishes remains to be seen. The story does not resolve. It simply stops. leaves us in a moment of uncertainty, of possibility, of potential that has not yet crystallized into actuality. This is the nature of Nosgoth, a world where fate is real but can be defied, where destiny is written but can be altered, where choices matter but their consequences remain uncertain. Cycles have been broken. The wheel has been wounded. The Elder God's control has been compromised. The timeline has branched in ways that were not intended, that create genuine uncertainty about what comes next. But uncertainty is not resolution. It is simply the absence of predetermination, the possibility that things could change, without the guarantee that they will change for the better. Nosgoth endures, dying, perhaps, but not dead. Not yet. Not while there remains uncertainty. Not while there remain beings who can make choices that matter. The pillars stand, cracked but not fallen. The world persists, decaying but not destroyed. The future remains unwritten, open to possibilities that could not have existed before. This is not an ending. It is simply a pause. A moment where the story stops being told, and what comes next remains unknown. The cycles are broken, but what replaces them has not yet been determined. And in that uncertainty, in that openness, in that possibility for something different, perhaps there is hope. However fragile, however uncertain, perhaps that is enough.